And your introductory remarks, please, James, perhaps if you'd like to introduce yourself and the team, 5 minutes, and then we will go through the structured agenda. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Atabari kia koutou. Good morning, committee. I'll do a quick round of introductions. We've got a good representation from the senior team. So sitting to my right, Laura Dixon, who is Deputy Secretary of Business Transformation Services. I've got Timmy Smiley here, who is our General Manager of Climate Change Mitigation. He's here because Deputy Secretary Sam Buckle, that will be known to some of you, who is responsible for that area, is on annual leave. Excuse me. Nadine Domasay, who's well known to the committee, who is our Deputy Secretary of Environmental Management and Adaptation, leads our work in the RMA in particular. Natasha Lewis, next to her, who is Deputy Secretary of Strategy, Stewardship and Performance. Glenn Wigley over there, who is our General Manager of Hazardous Substances and Waste Policy, also here in Sam's absence. Arun Patel, who is our Chief Financial Officer and General Manager of Finance and Procurement. Sitting over the back, Gina Rangi, who is our Deputy Secretary to Māori Kōkiri, Māori Strategy, and Haida over the back, who is Deputy Secretary of Partnerships, Implementation and Enablement. So you have the senior leadership of the ministry here to assist me with any questions that you might have of detail that I can't respond to. So, Chair, I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got an awful lot of policy and legislation that is in play at the moment that the committee will be interested in. But given the primary purpose of this exercise is a review of our 23-24 year, I thought I'd just confine my opening remarks at least to the year that has been. I think it's fair to say that for the Ministry for the Environment, this last year has been an unprecedented year in terms of delivery, but also change. Delivery and change in respect of the work, but also the organisation. So as we started the year, we were shepherding through this committee, the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act. We were standing up the new system with the National Planning Framework and the new Spatial Planning Policy Office and starting the spatial planning exercises with regions. We had freshwater regulations being implemented, and we were standing up a new freshwater farm planning system. We just started the phase out of single-use plastic. We had reformed the Waste Minimisation Act underway. We'd started a review of the ETS. We were implementing, of course, the first emissions reduction plan, the national adaptation plan. We had a select committee inquiry underway with this committee in relation to our climate adaptation. And that was all occurring with the backdrop of the severe weather events for which the ministry was heavily involved with the Auditors and Council that we were delivering, the waste management work we were doing with councils, and of course supporting the ministerial inquiry into land use. We had just produced our atmosphere and climate report as well. So the ministry was in full flight, had a very full work program, and we had a high degree of expectation around implementing all of the policy legislation that the then government had in play. Of course, we had the general election. Our preparation for that was substantial to ensure that the incoming government was well positioned to make decisions quickly. And indeed they did. And of course, we had the repeal of the Natural and Built Environment Spatial Planning Act and the introduction of the Fast Track Approvals Bill. That's been a big piece of work for the ministry this year, alongside the other resource management reform work we've been doing. Bill 1, the Freshwater and Other Matters RMA Amendment Bill that's now been passed with the Primary Production Select Committee. Work on a second bill, which is intended to be introduced by the end of this year. Significant changes to national direction, all foreshadowed in the coalition agreements and also obviously in manifesto commitments. So we're working through those with ministers with the intention for reform of national direction to occur in the new year. We've continued the work obviously on climate change adaptation with the inquiry shifting to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee and working with an independent reference group that's advising ministers on the climate adaptation package that we will be talking, no doubt, with the committee about more in the new year. We needed to produce a second emissions reduction plan. It's been a major body of work for the ministry this year, as well as the climate change strategy, which we produced for the new government, and a bunch of BAU in terms of curbside recycling, the Taiwai scheme being stood up, and producing our land State of Environment report in April. So the ministry had a very full work program at the start of the year. As we finished the year, it was just as full, but some significant change in policy direction, which we've been facilitating. So while that occurred, obviously we've also had significant organisational change. So when I spoke to the committee this time last year, we had commenced a review of our operating model, and that was in response to the fact that the ministry had a peak in funding in the 23-24 year, which was going to fund a total of 1,230 FTEs, but that funding was not sustainable over time, and the baseline was reducing. The mini budget shifted that picture again with the return of the $301 million for resource management reform implementation, $34 million for ETS market governance. And in budget 24, we returned a further $196 million over 4 years in savings. There's also the expansion of the waste levy the committee will be aware of, and that diverted $177 million worth of previously Crown-funded activity to waste levy funded activity over 4 years. So the total of that was a savings package of $710 million over 4 years that the ministry has been able to assist the government and the Treasury with in terms of balancing the books. Net, that is actually $617 million, because the ministry in budget 24 received $92 million for the next phase of resource management reform that we now have underway. It's a total of 34.5% reduction in departmental baseline from the financial year just finished out to 27-28. And so that's resulted in a downsizing process. We had our first tranche of that went live on 1st of December last year with a reduction in the senior management tiers, then consulted through this year on a much more substantial change, and that went live on the 1st of November. The consequence of that is 516 less roles from our peak, of which, because of the freeze we placed on recruitment and a sinking lid, is a total of 278 redundancies, 156 of which were voluntary. In addition to that, we ended fixed-term contracts for 148 fixed-term staff early. So substantial reduction in headcount, and the thing I just want to really conclude in saying, Chair, is that through that process, more than 700 of our staff were required to reapply for their roles. That's a significant impact, obviously, on them in terms of job security and the anxiety that goes with that. Also, an enormous job for managers across the organisation having to take everybody through that process. So the organisation's been through an amazing amount of change, quite a lot of uncertainty for a period for many of our staff. And the thing I would just like to acknowledge and pay tribute to here, Chair, is the extraordinary professionalism of the employees of the Ministry for the Environment in continuing to deliver a super ambitious work program right through that period, continuing to support select committees in a range of different pieces of legislation and inquiries, and to assist the government in its ambitious program of work while navigating all of that change. So that was a significant leadership challenge for the senior leadership. Pay tribute to my team here in navigating that. But as we finish the year, we're well positioned to live within the fiscal track that we have while continuing to deliver the government's work program. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, James. You've certainly been very busy. We just move into our next part of our structured agenda, which is overall performance of MFE 23-24. And I have a primary first up from Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you for that outline of all the great work you were doing at the start of this period. Not so impressed by the latter work. That's not about your people though.
Yeah.
It's completely about government priorities. But on this, I wanted to ask about the strategic intentions, and that's going to be changed. But why are they going to be changed? What might they be changed to? What is wrong with the current ones?
The strategic intentions that were in play at the start of the 23-24 year reflected the work program that had built under the previous government, which came with it a degree of capability in the ministry and a program of activity that was very much about working on the ground to implement a series of reforms across resource management, fresh water, and it was big on partnerships and enablement with communities. The funding for that was time limited, and we can think about the Jobs for Nature program, the Essential Fresh Water program, and even the resource management funding. So the ambition there to facilitate a lot of transformation on the ground was in of itself of a time limited nature. So the strategic intentions at that time reflected what the ministry was doing. What we've done is we've refreshed that with a view about where we're going from here, which is with less resource. And with less resource, the ministry is more focused on its core responsibilities under statute, and that is particularly its advisory role to government in terms of the policy and the legislative framework, and less in terms of on-the-ground activity. So it really just reflects a point in time and the changing nature of the ministry's mandate from government and also our resourcing profile.
So that would be consistent then with the reduction in funding to community hubs in freshwater groups as well. That's your point, that the move is all to policy and not on the ground implementation of environmental outcomes.
I think those are examples of where the more focused approach to our work program and the associated reductions in funding align with that change in strategic focus.
Thank you. We have a question from Nan.
Thank you for your opening comments. And I really just wanted to start with that overall kind of bigger picture question. But firstly, just for clarity's sake, often the savings for vote environment or the cuts being couched in the realm of 600 million over 4 years, it's compared to an eligible baseline. Can you explain what the eligible baseline refers to? Because I'm just noting then it says for the future, for 27-28, that the ministry's departmental baseline would be 39%. What does that mean?
So the eligible baseline was what was determined by Treasury through Budget 24 as being eligible for the calculation of savings. So the ministry was given a savings target of 7%. And that was not calculated on the entirety of the appropriation because there were some exclusions, particularly the emissions trading scheme allocations. So it's a subset of our overall appropriation on which the savings were calculated and therefore the percentage reductions are calculated.
Okay, thank you. Because I mean, I guess I'm noting, particularly in your forward, you're talking about how climate change and environmental degradation impact virtually every part of life and how challenging this is going to be for the country in actually meeting our social and economic challenges. Do you think the scale of expenditure that is actually coming into vote environment and MFE, and the PCE's noting that it's 2% of government expenditure, is that actually enabling us to get somewhere? And do you think it's been communicated enough that potentially we're sort of way out of the ballpark in terms of what we could be getting from economic growth and social development if we were to invest in our environment?
I think the ministry is funded and empowered to get somewhere. To answer your question, are we making progress? So clearly across the work program, there is progress that we are making in terms of emissions reduction, in terms of climate resilience, in terms of freshwater outcomes, and a more efficient and effective resource management system. So I think, yes, we are funded adequately to deliver improved outcomes for Aotearoa New Zealand. There is always a question for any government about the pace of that, and there is always an opportunity cost with respect to every taxpayer dollar that is allocated in our direction or to another area. Obviously, the reductions in the ministry's overall funding does reflect the broader fiscal backdrop and economic backdrop as well. So, we're very conscious of that. And that's why in refreshing our strategic intentions as a ministry, we're focusing on what are our greatest leverage points. And those are very much in how we enable the system to make better decisions. And it will be over to communities, industries, etc., to do much of the heavy lifting. And the extent of subsidisation or financial support that the government gives to that is a choice for government in terms of how fast it wants to go. But obviously, there, as I said before, there are trade-offs around that for the government. We're focusing on what is our core role in the system, and I believe that we are adequately resourced to undertake our core role.
Just a
Thank you.
supplementary. So just talking about sort of that leveraging of investment, is there moves within MFE to understand that kind of dollar for dollar investment? Because, like, for example, with stats, we heard census, for every dollar they spend, they get $4 or $5. Society benefits from that. And, we've had recent reports from the likes of Ernst Young that's, said if we were to invest in our environment adequately, we would be talking in the hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of payback to society. Are there moves within MFE to better understand that kind of what society is getting back from investment?
So 2 recent examples that we have undertaken, the first of which has yet to go before Cabinet, so I won't quote the specifics, but it has been publicly disclosed in budget papers that the ministry was asked to undertake a cost benefit analysis of investment in the waste disposal levy. So that work has been undertaken, and without disclosing the substance of that advice, what I can say is it does show that there is a positive benefit arising from those investments. We've also undertaken cost benefit analysis in relation to the Jobs for Nature program, and that has also demonstrated that there are significant benefits from that investment. The thing I would say about it is that you can look right across the government's expenditure and activity and find examples where investments, whether it be in health or welfare or in infrastructure, etc., do yield benefits. And I think it's fair to say that large parts of the Crown's expenditure do deliver long-term benefits that give a return on that investment. Doesn't change the fact that there is still a finite quantum of Crown money to invest, and those are obviously inherently political decisions for government to make about where it wants to put its emphasis.
Thank you.
Thank you. We did have a supplementary from Rachel and then Scott, and then we've got time at primary from Jen.
Yes, and mine's going back to my question, but it's related as well. So my question was about updating those strategic intentions, and you talked a lot about the focus is moving away from on the ground and partnerships and moving towards policy. And I note, we've had the 23.6 million cut from Jobs for Nature. That's not the ending of the funding, that's a cut of money that went back. So wondering then, my question is, the strategic intentions, will they just be about policy? And will there be anything on work that your ministry will be doing in considering the environmental outcomes of the changes that are being made to the legislation and these various cuts from a lot of this partnership work?
So in relation to our work on the ground and with communities, that is still part of our operating model, and we are not retreating to being simply a policy shop. I think one of the long-standing criticisms of the Ministry for the Environment was that it was overly insular oriented towards central government here in Wellington and was not well connected to the system that it was responsible for stewarding. That has changed over time, and the ministry has built in recent years significant capability in understanding the local government planning system, working with industries, working with communities. So we are retaining a degree of that capability. What I have had to confront is the fact that the funding to support that capability to do work on the ground was overwhelmingly time limited. Jobs for Nature is due to finish on 30th of June this year. So there is funding, which is and there was funding associated with obviously freshwater and the
And
previous
those are
resource.
choices that the government has made to not do any to not continue them at all. I know that they're time limited, but a new government could have continued some of those. The government has chosen not to. But in addition, you gave back what 23.6 million from the Jobs for Nature fund. So that's not to do with it being time limited. That's to do with the government asking for more money back.
Correct. So that funding that came out of the Jobs for Nature was unallocated funding at the end of the cycle. So it was, and in the context of the 1.3 billion initially allocated, it was a relatively small sum. And that was over 4 years. So it was really.
So you're saying that the updated strategic intentions are not going to be just about being a policy shop. They are going to be still about the partnerships, because under the Labour-led governments, there was that change of focus from the MFE that I used to work with when I was in private practice. So my other question was, what consideration are you doing of environmental outcomes with all the policy work that's happening and these changes to partnership?
So the Ministry is continuing to undertake its state of environment monitoring work, obviously under the Environmental Reporting Act. Amendments to that legislation were being worked on by the previous government, and we've continued to work with the Minister for the Environment on those. And we do anticipate still bringing forward an Environmental Reporting Act amendment bill that will further strengthen and improve that regime in line with the recommendations from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. So in terms of measuring outcomes, the Ministry is very much committed to continuing its role in that to support good policy making. So I don't think there's anything about that is mutually exclusive with dialing back the extent to which we are working on the ground with communities directly. So I wouldn't want to suggest that the Ministry is stepping back from a focus on either measuring outcomes or ensuring that policy is implemented. We're just having to focus on our absolutely core statutory responsibilities and be more circumspect about what we are doing that might be the work of others in the system.
But also what the policy outcomes are, the results of the policy in terms of whether or not it will be beneficial for the environment. Is that work continuing?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Thank you. From Scotland.
Thank you. And I really want to build on Lauren's question and Rachel's question in relation to the strategic intention change and the move away from on the ground connection to a degree. The cost benefit analysis, have you measured, for example, the investment into EnviroHub's Aotearoa and the value of that for environmental development, for economic resilience in our communities, and the cost of that to government and the value that that's given back? Has that been measured? And I ask that because I'm very aware EnviroHub's Aotearoa have had a very good relationship with MFE. And I'm also very aware that they've lost their funding from MFE. It was due to continue through to 2026, I think. And that's put the sector into disarray. So if we're thinking about value and benefit and maintaining trust and connections, where are you sitting with that?
So in our advice to ministers in Budget 24, we did advise that funding to Environment Hubs Aotearoa achieves a higher level of leverage in terms of particularly voluntary effort, and that what is a relatively modest level of funding does enable the hubs to undertake quite a large amount of activity that effectively the Crown doesn't pay for and is leveraged. So that general advice was provided. In terms of quantifying that level of leverage or additionality from the funding, I don't think we quantified that in the advice, but I am, in the back of my mind, I'm going to turn to Natasha here. I think we have, there has been an evaluation undertaken of that funding for Environment Hubs Aotearoa, whether it was undertaken by them or us. I can't quite recall. Am I correct on that?
Different program.
Right.
Not for that program. Yeah, not for that program.
No. So our advice was general in nature, which is that it provides leverage, but no, we haven't quantified what that is.
And in relation to that, the relationship with the community providers, is that still ongoing? Is that something that you hope to be able to maintain despite the lack of funding? How are you going to maintain that connection with the community to understand? And I anticipate getting that feedback, understanding what environmental conditions are like, understanding the health of the voluntary sector is like. How are you going to be able to monitor that without that stronger relationship?
So we're continuing engaging with Environment Hubs Aotearoa, and it would be certainly our desire to maintain a good level of visibility across regional New Zealand about the community activity that's occurring. But we have to be realistic about what is our resource to do that in a period of retrenchment. We won't have the same level of connectivity with the community sector that we've had in recent years. I think that's an accepted fact of of our lower level of resourcing. We do continue to engage the network in more specific work opportunities. They have historically been heavily involved in waste minimisation projects. The waste minimisation levy will continue to be dispersed through the Waste Minimisation Fund, which is obviously broader now in its application. So I think it presents an opportunity for those community groups to apply for funding on a project basis into the future. So I expect that we will continue to have an ongoing relationship, and there will continue to be work done between the ministry and the hubs. It's just that general level of funding of their ongoing capability that has been reduced, and I think has been removed. And I think that is the reality of some really hard decisions that ministers have had to take in relation to savings target that was set across our appropriations, and some funding which had merit, but unfortunately can't be continued. And I think certainly the hope that I've heard our own minister express is that there will be other ways in which those community groups can receive funding through sponsorships and community fundraising,
Because
etc.
there's so many of them available at the moment.
And finally on that, so given that Enviro Hubs Aotearoa is one example of losing staff right now, and given that you've no longer got that strong focus or connection, how well will you be able to monitor what is happening in the community and on the ground? How will you simply move to more of a Wellington focus?
Well, I think, our primary conduit into communities and regions is through local government. They are ultimately the ones who are responsible for the implementation of the resource management system, and are the ones most proximal to their communities, including in areas like waste minimisation as well. So that has always been our primary conduit, and it will remain so. So I expect that we'll continue to get a reasonable level of visibility of the community sector.
Well, local government's not community sector.
No, as the conduit to those communities. Yeah.
Rachel.
Right, so we're moving now to the climate change.
Oh, I had a sup on Rachel's. I can change one. Just picking up on your response to Rachel about, ongoing environmental outcome monitoring generally. I wondered about you sort of list on page 16 in our performance context all the work that you've been doing sort of on top of where you were with your strategic framework, where you were talking about the ministry being in full flight, and then obviously the government came in and that changed, and then the work that you've delivered as part of their 100-day plan. And I'm wondering, as part of this, these are things like repealing the oil and gas ban, freshwater protections being weakened or removed or delayed, and even the implications of the fast track bill. Do you have any kind of assessment about what the environmental impact and outcomes of those kinds of legislative decisions that the government's making actually have on the environment or may have in the future?
Well, we've provided advice on, on a wide range of bits of legislation or policy reform undertaken during this term, and you'd have to. I mean, you can't generalise. It's on a case-by-case basis. I know, for example, that there's been concerns raised about the extent to which the environmental implications of the fast track approvals bill have been quantified. I think the reality is that the fast track approvals bill is a framework for decision making, and it will depend case by case. It will depend on the projects that are applied for. It will depend on the decisions that are made by decision makers through the process. So I don't think you can ex ante assess what is the impact of that. And that's obviously still before the House, and there will remain to be a number of amendments to that bill before it is enacted, I'm sure. So it's got a way to go. So look, the ministry has provided advice through the year on a range of matters. The potential increase in greenhouse gases from the lifting of the oil and gas ban that has been publicly reported and has been quantified, so that's understood. So on the way through, there are things that the ministry has advised on, and so I wouldn't like the perception to, I guess, arise that the ministry has been missing in action in terms of providing advice to ministers through the year on all those matters.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So are we ready now to move on to the climate change and natural hazards section of our agenda? Did you have a starter for 10, did you, Rachel?
Yes, I do. So starting on we have on an agenda that climate change adaptation is first, so I'll start with that too. I've got a number of questions around it. And I'll start with the wide one, and that is around hazards and the work in stopping new things being built in the wrong places now. So obviously the Natural and Built Environments Act had some stronger language around hazards than the RMA does. There's been work underway for some national direction and national policy statements. We realise that you're changing that now. Can you give us an indication of where that work is at and what the timeframes are? And another sort of wider question is, one of the pillars of the climate strategy, the fifth one, is about nature-based solutions. And how is that going to relate nature-based solutions to work on hazards and avoiding them immediately? So I'm not talking about existing things that might be in places that are going to be affected by sea level rise or something like that, but what can we do to stop new problems from existing? What work's happening there, please?
So a couple of elements to the work program. The first of which is that it's recognised that there were amendments through the Natural and Built Environment Act that were going to modernise what sits in our resource management system in terms of primary statute around natural hazard management. Those concepts have been picked up and are going to be progressed through the Bill number 2, which is soon to be introduced. So there will be changes to the RMA that will strengthen the ability of councils to manage natural hazards. So that primary legislative reform is imminent. Okay. Secondly, the committee will hopefully be aware that ministers have made a decision to bundle national direction changes into packages to minimise the impact on stakeholders from a lot of ongoing consultation and engagement. So in the bundled package of national direction for consultation next year, we will have the national policy statement on natural hazards, building on the work that had been done previously. So both in terms of primary statute and secondary regulation, that work is
So just to interrupt you, and I know you're going to have more to say on the question, James, but to clarify, you're saying the equivalent of what was in the NBA that was repealed a year ago is going to be in the new bill that's going to be introduced soon. And the equivalent of the work that was being done on natural direction is going to be promoted sometime next year with a bundle of other natural direction.
That's broadly true. Look, obviously Cabinet will make decisions at the margins about precisely how that is reflected, but that is broadly the intent, is to ensure.
So I mean, can I say then that, is it fair to say, so there's been at least a year's delay on both of those pieces of work?
Well, obviously we've had to tie in with the government's legislative program and also the national direction program, and yes, it is fair to say that ministers have made conscious decisions about programming the national direction public consultation program to ensure that we don't end up with a constant rolling wall, if you like, of engagements. They're trying to package it in a way that national direction is as internally consistent as possible. And of course, the committee will remember the work around the national planning framework.
Absolutely, that's why I'm saying it's an equivalent. And do you consider as well, and I know I have to keep interrupting you, but for the usefulness of the discussion, do you consider that the work, both the statute and the regulations, will be contentious, or is it likely to be things that should be bipartisan? And I ask that because when we were working on the Natural and Built Environments Bill, as it was, there was a lot of agreement that we need to do much better in natural hazard space and enabling local governments to say no. And so that is why I'm frustrated that there's a delay when it seems to be something that people should be able to agree on, but maybe things have changed and maybe this is going to be quite contentious.
Certainly don't anticipate it being contentious. I mean, this is an enabling framework for local government, particularly around standardised methodologies for risk assessment and how that is reflected in planning documents. So I think there is a high degree of consensus around this. So we're not anticipating anything. Of course, the devil's in the detail, and the contention arises at local level when it comes to implementation. And I know that we all aspire to ensure that development does not occur in harm's way. What constitutes harm's way in any given locality becomes highly debatable between different scientists, engineers, different risk appetites, all of those sorts of things. And that's where I think this will continue to be a challenging area for local government to implement. In respect of the question around nature-based solutions, so I guess I'd observe that we have had statute in place since 1941 to enable local government to deal with what was probably some of our earliest and most significant natural hazard events relating to flooding and erosion within our catchments. So the Soil Conservation Rivers Control Act has empowered that, and we've had a lot of work around nature-based solutions, if you like, with respect to pole planting and landscapes, erosion control, and river management. So I think that remains an ongoing area of innovation and evolution for local government in particular.
So that's what you'd call nature-based solution is?
So in terms of things like giving rivers more room to move, thinking about the role of wetlands and landscapes, I mean, I think you'll find right across the country that local governments increasingly using those tools.
But more recently, not since the 1950s, or are you saying that?
No, what I'm saying is that we've had tools, and I think planting and landscapes are effectively a nature-based solution.
In terms of erosion control.
Erosion control, which obviously drives, an awful lot of flooding. So really what, what I wanted to say is that it's not as if there has been nothing happening on nature-based solutions and we have yet to start as a country. This is a progression and it's an ongoing area of innovation that local government leads out. In terms of the national policy statement and the amendments to the RMA, they won't necessarily create any significant step change in terms of the use of nature-based solutions, but that will continue to encourage the exploration and utilisation of those.
So you're not
that are available.
anticipating any new in the national direction framework that's going to be coming next year, and in the statutory changes that you're talking about, you're not imagining or telling us that there'll be anything specifically on new tools for enabling nature-based solutions?
So not in the legislation, but in terms of the national policy statement, I'm sure, Dean, if you want to comment if there's anything specifically in the draft NPS. I mean, obviously, we don't want to get ahead of the cabinet consideration, and that will be there'll be cabinet decision making early next year, and there'll be consultation on that.
But it's not a major work stream at the moment.
Not a major work stream, but the only sort of additional comment that I'd make is we are continuing to explore how to make the consenting system more efficient, particularly when it comes to things like putting in place wetlands for a range of different purposes. So that's part of our broader work around both the Resource Management Act to ensure that the system doesn't get in the way when you're looking at making those type of nature-based solutions, because sometimes at a grassroots level it can.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And would that fit into any spatial planning considerations as well?
Not in terms of the detail of spatial planning. That's obviously something that's been closely looked at as part of the phase 3 for the resource management reforms, which I'm sure we'll get into. So, but spatial planning is operating at a much broader scale, of course, but certainly the opportunity at that level to think about where your critical infrastructure is and also where your high value natural environment areas are.
What about room for the river? Wouldn't that be at such a big spatial, wouldn't that be more of a special?
That's exactly right. So those type of landscape level features certainly come into that level of planning. Thanks.
This is a supplementary, Simon.
Yes.
Yeah.
On climate adaptation. We've seen some really interesting interpretation of MFE guidance on how to assess and manage coastal hazards. And I just want to refer back to the climate change guidance that MFE has put out. Most recently, I think there was an updated one in the middle of this year. And just thinking about how different councils like Kapiti Coast District Council have used information about the risk of sea level rise and potentially gone down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of extrapolating from MFE guidance. Like, what is the scenario that they should be testing when they're looking at coastal hazards and risk? Should they be testing the most extreme scenario, assuming that we don't reduce our emissions ever at all by any measurable degree, or should they be picking a middle road which says, look, we don't know what major industrial emitters are going to do, but we know what countries like New Zealand and the EU and Australia are going to do in terms of what they've signalled with mitigation of emissions. So I'm just wondering, does MFE, do you have a view on how this might be used practically? Just considering, an extreme approach is not necessarily going to be helpful to long-term asset management, planning where communities should live, or maybe it's not safe to live, if there's a more moderate approach.
I think the overarching choice for government here is the extent to which central government wants to be prescriptive versus enabling some local decision making and some local variation. The guidance is intended to inform high quality decision making by ensuring that various different scenarios are taken into account and are considered. So scenarios that do see less global action on emissions reduction part of that guidance, obviously, considering what is, I guess, the outside risk. But then for communities to make decisions about what level of risk is acceptable. So in the current framework, we would expect the local authority to engage the community in a high quality conversation about the uncertainties associated with projections and the level of risk that the community considers is tolerable. There is a choice, however, given that that may result in highly variable decision-making across the country for government to consider, particularly as phase 3 of the resource management reforms and replacement of the RMA is considered, the extent of standardisation that we want to see here. So the work that we are presently doing with the independent reference group and have done recently with the Finance and Expenditure Committee does suggest that from a banking and insurance and property market point of view, more standardisation of that risk assessment would enable probably better pricing of insurance risk and I guess a more orderly transition for the country around things like sea level rise. So that remains work for us to do, and that remains choices for ministers to make. In the meantime, the guidance is what it is, and some councils are obviously getting on with making some decisions on that. But I think that's work to do, and that is the choice, really.
Yeah, okay. Mention on that. Do you think it would be helpful to, and we just come back to this example of Kapiti Coast District Council, which has used best endeavours. They've picked the most extreme scenario to test what their climate risk is. A scenario which frankly assumes no climate mitigation will occur at all, and we'll just continue to burn fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. Do you think that small councils are really equipped to make those judgments? Because I mean, we've got 67 district councils, around New Zealand, 12, 14 regional councils. I mean, if they all pick their own approach, we could have wildly different approaches to what is assessed as coastal risk and what the cost implications in those communities are. Do you think that councils need some help with this more urgently?
Chair, I think the question the member raises is kind of like the fundamental question that sits at the heart of the resource management system, and that's the extent to which a principle of subsidiarity or devolution to local decision making is genuinely tractable with complex science questions and technical questions, and what are the unforeseen consequences of high levels of variability nationally. And so I think what we've seen over time is a scaffolding of increasing amounts of national direction as central government has sought to assist local government with more guidance and decision making. And we're at a point now that in considering the replacement of the RMA, government is going to need, and ultimately Parliament's going to need to make some decisions about whether under the Resource Management Act, we were overly optimistic about the capacity and capability of communities to make complex decisions with a high degree of local discretion, and whether we actually need to move to a regime that is more nationally standardised.
Interesting. Thank you.
Scott Willis, new question.
Thank you. And I appreciate that you're going to move to a regime that's more standardised and with a more orderly transition. And I'm wondering, we have the situation in South Dunedin where there's reasonably regular flood events, and local government has invested quite heavily in the South Dunedin Future program to work with community, and has developed what I think is a unique model of community engagement that is effectively dynamic adaptive pathway planning for the transition with coastal setback, with the community voice. And I'm wondering what your engagement with the South Dunedin Future program is, and whether you think there is use and value in that model as a template to help standardise adaptation around the motu, and how we might be able to support that rather than relying simply on local government to do all the heavy lifting in central government, not learning from what's been done and how that might be used.
So we have engaged with the Dunedin project through time, and see it as a really useful case study in how communities might approach managed retreat and the different decision pathways that the communities might want to contemplate with their various different trade-offs. So It is one of a number of, small number of initiatives nationally that the ministry is learning from and building into our advice to ministers following the inquiry by the Finance and Expenditure Committee and the work that we're doing with the Independent Reference Group. I think what's evident in the Dunedin case is that we don't have a clear national framework that allocates roles and responsibilities, resolves issues of cost and risk apportionment between central government, local government, homeowners, their insurers and banks. So that is work to do. So if you like, that community, similar to the Clifton to Tangoio project in the Hawke's Bay, where local government has tried to get ahead of the issues by putting in place a framework, but it's not a framework that's readily supported by existing statutes. So that is the work that lies ahead of us next year, and it is my expectation that if Parliament is of a will to, that it will develop a framework that will be much more supportive of those sorts of initiatives in terms of providing certainty to those communities about what support they can expect.
Do you think that there's a place for government to be a bit more active in, as it develops legislation, as it develops the statute for adaptation, in ensuring that it can help find the best way forward? Because we've got the situation in Westport that looks like it needs to relocate, and Westport's doing that work already. But here in South Dunedin, the South Dunedin Future Programme have already gone to government to say we need some resource to push this further, faster now. And the community is getting hit by flooding events more and more regularly. This is a learning opportunity. And do you see this as an opportunity for government to, for a relatively modest investment, understand how community that is making decisions effectively participatory budgeting, if you like, in adaptation, how a community is taking control with central government learning from that? Do you think there's an opportunity here for government to take this further?
Look, I'm aware that that project has sought funding from Treasury and DIA in recent times, and I believe was declined funding. I think the thing that the government is mindful of at the moment is that there are many communities facing these sorts of challenges, and yes, South Dunedin is a particularly acute case, but there's a precedent question, and what ministers have resolved to do is to address the primary statutory and policy questions. So I think right now all of the appropriate work is being done. Minister Watts has indicated that he wanted to rebalance the climate change work program more broadly to have a bigger focus on adaptation than it had. This year, his approach was to sponsor the Finance and Expenditure Committee to undertake that inquiry. Obviously, the Independent Reference Group to provide its advice. All of that advice is coming forward for Cabinet consideration in the very near future. And 2025 is going to be a year of focus on adaptation, policy and legislative reform. That's what Minister Watts has indicated is his priority. So, yeah, I don't think central government is passive in the space. I think, and we're working very closely with the Treasury on that. I discussed the matter with the Secretary of the Treasury on Monday as priority work between us. It's just that this community initiative in this case is having to wait for a national framework to be put in place. But you can understand why there's a degree of caution and hesitance around that, because it will set precedent. It needs to be nationally applicable, and it ultimately needs to be durable, which is why I know Minister Watts has been talking across the House to try to seek a broad level of parliamentary support.
Last one.
Could one not argue that perfect is the enemy of good in this case? Because we have reviews, we have inquiries, we have any number of reports, and at the same time, we have people in flooded homes that are happening more and more often. And I have rowed across paddocks to rescue sheep in floods in 2006. That has been going on since then, at the very least, that there are homes being lost each and every year, insurance being lost. So we don't know how bad that is. And so while government figures out what it's going to do and how it's going to best do this and then kicks the can down the road a little bit further, is there not a place for a bit of boldness and experimentation to try and figure it out through doing rather than reporting on what might be perfect?
Look, I do think there have been a number of initiatives that have given us a good sense of what the potential responses to the various challenges here could be. And we have had the previous government had a ministerial working group that developed a report on managed retreat that flowed into this committee's inquiry towards the end of the last parliamentary term. That has also been fed into the work of the Finance and Expenditure Committee. So I think we've had a pretty thorough exploration of the issues, and I'm not sure that we need a lot more prototyping. What we now need to do is get on and amend the legislative framework, and that is the focus of the government.
Really last one, Rachel.
Thank you. So the national framework that you're talking about, I don't disagree with, and of course that came from the Renderson review and has been worked on for some time. I do think, though, given the length of time since that idea was promoted to now having that select committee report back, and I just want a quick answer on this, that it is a difficult issue. It's more difficult, I think, than stopping new things going in Hazard's way. You're nodding. I'll take that as a yes. And then talking about the South Dunedin issue, and you talked about how you didn't want to set a precedent that central government would be involved in these issues. But surely the way to get around that problem is that it's a useful case study and it would be a pilot, and you can say that. So do you want to comment on that concern you have around the precedents and how, in fact, that could be overcome? And it's really a financial decision, isn't it? Which the government's entitled to do.
The ministry doesn't have any funding available for such purposes, and I think we're in a position to provide the necessary advice to government about the choices here and about how to design a regime from here on, and it will be ultimately over to Parliament to amend the statutory framework and put in place a climate adaptation framework for New Zealand. So while I appreciate that the community down there wants to get on, and to some extent they're going to need to wait for some national decisions, because decisions that are taken in South Dunedin will be consequential for every part of New Zealand. Decisions that you're working on the entirety of last term, that were raised in the term before, and that the report back from the FEC was only at a very high principled level and did not say where the funding would be coming from. Certainly, from the ministry's perspective, we have what we need to be able to provide advice. The rest is over, obviously, to ministers and ultimately Parliament. Well, into Treasury.
Yeah. Glenn, you primary.
Thank you. This government's made choices around policy settings, around funding allocations, and obviously as a ministry you've had to make cuts, which is obviously out of your control. And you spoke earlier about, was it 516 roles no longer exist? How are you, I guess ask you to give us a high level sort of how you're managing to carry out your mandate, your responsibilities. Are you able to continue all the work that is required of you? And if so, how are you actually managing to do that on a lesser budget and with less staff?
So the headcount we started the 23-24 year with was at least partly and quite substantially driven by the implementation of the last round of resource management reforms. So with the repeal of the MBA and SBA, we were able to stop a number of those work programs and therefore not require the headcount for that. We've also had some change to the rollout of the freshwater program, and so that's enabled us also to not apply the level of resource to that had been anticipated. And so we have been able to also, with agreement with ministers, dial back some of the more discretionary work that the ministry was doing. So a smaller number of projects. So we've tailored the work program to the resources that we have. The resourcing level that the ministry has scales down over the next couple of years. So the numbers that you quoted before, that I quoted at the start, include reductions that will occur on the 30th of June of the current financial year. So the ministry takes a further step down of around 145 FTEs at 30 June this year, because we have a number of staff on delayed redundancy provisions. So in the current financial year, we're able to continue to deliver the government's work program. As we get to out years, there will need to be more choices by ministers about the work program of the agency, and we have foreshadowed that with ministers. But we have also foreshadowed the fact that the new resource management system that is anticipated will also require implementation. The $92 million in budget 24 was for the policy development program over a 4-year process, including the development of national standards, national direction, etc., and some to support the stand up of the fast track approvals bill. When it gets to implementation of the new regime, it may well be that further resources are required, and that will be a conversation with ministers. But until we know the shape of the legislation, it would only be speculation stage as to what those resourcing requirements are.
Yeah, thank you. Can you give us some examples of that discretionary work that you've stopped?
For example, we were doing work on natural capital accounting and valuation, working with other agencies around that. We had work going in the marine space, obviously related to, and it was a bit related to the Kermadec Ocean Sanctuary, and obviously that legislation came to an end. And we've also had to pare back some of the work we do in the science, evidence and data space to a more core program, and gave a haircut to some elements of that. I don't know, Tash, whether you want to describe any more of that?
I'm looking forward to the opportunity with the specific agenda item, but yeah, we've had to take a targeted approach to our science and data program. So moving from more system level change to targeted investment and focus, particularly around natural hazards and land use. So relevant to the last conversation. So we'll pick this up in the agenda item to come.
Yeah, and one more on this, please, is around climate change mitigation, in terms of you having to, I guess, retract in terms of your as a organisation. So how are you managing? Because there's a whole lot of responsibility that sits on you as a ministry. How are you managing that with funding constraints and staffing constraints?
So the transition from emissions reduction plan number 1 to emissions reduction plan number 2 sees a narrowing of focus. So the government is taking obviously a net-based least cost approach to mitigation, and the government's climate strategy is a more focused set of activities relative to what sat in the first emissions reduction plan, which was over 300 actions. So what we are seeing is the closing out of some of the things that sat in the first emissions reduction plan, and a refined work program that is narrower. So that's required a smaller cohort, if you like, of staff to deliver that work program. So we have been able to narrow that.
And so you're confident you'll be able to deliver with the team you have?
Yes, confident we can deliver the emissions reduction plan number 2, which has obviously been consulted on and subject to contemporary cabinet decision making, will be released shortly.
Scott, you've got a supplement.
So just in relation to the public service cuts, staffing cuts, and the insecurity that might have presented to some members and the lack of capacity, I'm mindful of the government's program, the Electrify New Zealand program, which the government intends to deliver. And there was a promise to deliver a new national policy statement for renewable electricity generation within 6 months of this government forming. We're now a year in, we haven't got that. Is that lack of delivery a consequence of the staffing cuts or the budget cuts or both, or what's that lack of delivery
related to?
So the timing of delivery of that is related to what I mentioned earlier around ministers' decisions to package up national direction into sector-facing bundles, so that there was not a rolling maul of consultation on different bits of national direction. Under the Resource Management Act, amendments to national direction involve a not insignificant process of consultation, consideration of submissions, evaluation of the costs and benefits, etc. It's a relatively long process, notwithstanding amendments to speed that up. So given what's involved with amending national direction, the government was keen to do that in a packaged way. Minister Bishop has set out the phases of reform, and the priority for the ministry from the government was initially the work to introduce the repeal legislation, introduce the fast track approvals bill, and also the first RMA, freshwater and other matters amendment bill. So given that those were the priority of ministers, the amendments to national direction, including the renewable energy MPS, was programmed to be in phase 2, and so has taken a little bit longer. I think it's fair to say that the government would have ideally had all of the amendments to national direction that were foreshadowed in the coalition agreements enacted quickly, but there are only so many resources available both to the ministry but also the government's legislative program too. So what I would say is it's on track, and the amendments to that, the production of that national policy statement, the amendments to that will come through in the package next year.
Some might say back on.
I'd say most of us would.
I don't think it was ever on track, but
That's why we're in the
well, I guess
Further this up, and then we're going to go, we've got primaries from Rachel and Simon to follow, so it's
no. So thank you for explaining and helping us understand that there is an important bit of work that goes into setting national direction. Do you think it was a little bit naive, or possibly not, maybe not naive, but do you think it was wise for the minister to promise that a new national policy statement would be delivered within 6 months?
I have to speak on that.
To be honest, Chair, I'm not aware of this particular commitment, and I'm not disputing that it may have been made, but certainly the ministry has simply been working to the work program that has been set by ministers, and what I'm pleased to say is that the ministry has delivered each and every deliverable in the various 100-day work programs, 3-month work programs that have been set by government. So we had an agreed work program with the minister, and we have delivered that and continue to do so.
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, new question.
Thanks. I'm still on climate adaptation, but my last question on it, and I'm very happy to hear, James, that the ministry is all ready to go on the adaptation framework laws for existing things that may or may not need to be moved at some point in the future. But one of those things that may or may not be moved, obviously, marae, and there's been work going on in terms of climate resilience for Māori, and there was an initiative for that. That appears to have been cut or changed. Can you advise us on the status of that work?
I was just looking for Gina, who I think has had to go to another meeting. She's been overseeing that work under Te Pou Taki Ahurangi, which is the National Climate Change Po with the National Iwi Chairs Forum. So Minister Watts has been working with the Iwi Chairs co-lead Marama Royal on a reset of that work program. The current work that is underway is a risk assessment program for marae and papakainga around the country. And the intention is to use those risk assessments to enable planning around climate hazards. So that work program is on track, and I think I anticipate there'll be some announcements early in the new year around that program.
But the funding was reduced?
Yes, the funding was reduced. So the out-year funding, so the funding for the first 2 years of the program was retained, and the funding in the the third and fourth of the 4-year program was returned as part of the savings program. And that was particularly in response to Minister Watts wanting to develop a work program before Cabinet committed out-year funding for a purpose that had yet to be determined.
So future budget bids coming.
That will be over to the Minister.
Have you got a supplementary, Scott?
Just on Rachel's, yes.
Yes, okay.
Quickly. Has MFE conducted any analysis on how the fast tracks legislation provisions will impact on the adaptation framework?
Answer that.
Sure, I can. Certainly as part of the, certainly as part of the fast track legislative process, we provided a range of advice around how, say, natural hazards should be considered. So that is one of the things that's been built into, as I understand it, into the referral step for the Minister in terms of the considerations. So coming back to what James was saying before about the fast track legislation, essentially is a process legislation. So it is dependent upon the nature of the project, but certainly in terms of that being a consideration, it's been provided for, or the advice has been provided for as part of the different steps of fast track.
And do you have confidence that the process will be robust enough to ensure that there are not projects that are developed in that are not climate resilient, or that there may be people placed in harm's way?
The legislation, as reported back, certainly provides through both the referral process and through the substantive expert panel consideration process for those matters to be considered. And one of the additional opportunities through that legislation is for portfolio ministers to also have their views sought if matters such as climate, natural hazards or other environmental matters are relevant. So again, coming back to it being a process legislation, it certainly provides for those matters to be considered.
Simon, your question.
Yeah, thank you. Just coming back to climate change mitigation and how we measure our emissions. There's a number of different ways to do it, and I'm wondering if you could just give us your overviews as to the merits or costs and benefits of using a single gas approach versus a split gas approach, which for people who don't know what that means is looking.
I think you can assume that we do know it.
Well, I'm just thinking about the listeners at home, anyone who might be watching.
This is a meeting of the committee.
Yeah.
So can you go to your question?
So I'm really interested in what you see as the costs and benefits of using a single gas approach to measure our emissions versus a split gas approach.
The question of a split gas approach relates less to the measurement of the unit of gas, if you like, but to how they are summed around a total level of emissions that the nation produces. Given that different gases have different lengths of life and different warming effects, the UNFCCC's, that's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's approach to measurement seeks to standardise those into CO2 equivalents based on assessed levels of global warming potential. That seeks to reconcile a complex set of dynamics between gases that have, in the case of methane, a greater level of warming in the short term to CO2, but a much lower level over time as the gas degrades and is complicated by the fact that it degrades into CO2, amongst other things, and has a complex set of interactions within the atmosphere, depending on where in the atmosphere that gas is released. So atmospheric physics is extraordinarily complex, and to try and simplify it down so that countries' overall emissions can be quantified in a single number and compared country to country involves a high level of judgment, if you like. They're effectively policy decisions as opposed to scientific decisions. So the global community has come up with some ways of doing that. And it has some cost and benefits. So the cost benefit question wouldn't relate so much to our science and technical work. It would relate to how New Zealand thinks about what is its overall level of emissions, how it sets its targets, and whether it seeks to enable a degree of kind of cross-subsidisation, if you like, across the economy between different emitting sectors and their gases into some overall balanced equation as to what is New Zealand's total emissions. In doing that, you create some potential flexibility, but you also create some equity issues between sectors and how they're treated as well. So it's a very large question the member has asked, and that would be a sort of a generalised statement. Hemi, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Very well, James.
Just for supplementary, that try and laser it in then. So is there a risk that, given our agricultural emissions are often regarded as being half of New Zealand's emissions, that by treating methane from bovine ruminant animals in the same way as we treat, say, CO2 that comes out of the tailpipe of a truck, is there a risk that we actually force a higher cost on the rural sector in terms of having to pay for or account for their emissions if we just lump everything together under CO2 versus saying actually methane is discrete, it is separate, it can be viewed separately?
I think decisions by successive governments to exclude agriculture from the ETS, noting that when the ETS was enacted in 2008, it was all sectors and there had to be an exemption, if you like, for agriculture. The decision by successive governments since then to keep it out recognises that agricultural emissions are different, both in terms of how they can be managed, but also in terms of their biophysical effect. And I think that's remained an unresolved issue and is part of the reason why the government initiated the methane review, which was released yesterday, and ministers are now considering the recommendations of that. So I think the report raises a number of these issues and these choices from a policy-making perspective as to how to treat two different gases that have different biophysical effects, but also have different management challenges associated with them.
Thank you. Helpful.
We seem now to have morphed seamlessly into mitigation. Do you?
Yes, great. No, mine was just a no, I thought you were going to go a new one.
No. We seem to.
There you. So did you have a scheduled break at 11 a.m.?
11:05.
11:05.
Oh, right. Okay.
Depends on the length of the question, Simon. What's up?
Just a supplementary on the kind of no additional warming basis. So does the ministry consider that adopting a no additional warming on a baseline of 2017 basis for methane emissions would be a rather unique approach in the world, or is there an equivalent approach elsewhere?
Would you have an answer to that?
There's no other approach or no other country that has adopted that approach at this stage that we are aware of. And so no additional warming may be unique for the New Zealand context, but so we're setting a split gas target for 2050. And no other country around the world has an emissions profile like New Zealand, and that less than 50% of our emissions are from carbon dioxide. And so while most other countries are focused on their energy transition and working on reducing emission from carbon dioxide, New Zealand has a different challenge, and the split gas target was put in place to reflect that different challenge.
Thank you.
Do you want to start
Yep,
your
yep.
question now, or do you want to wait until after our
I'll
break?
start.
Because we could go
Might
to
be
a break
quick.
a couple of minutes early, seeing as it's keen.
Yeah.
If you wanted to wait until we
We're going around.
need to have
Okay.
a decent
Okay, we
go.
can wait.
Okay, I suggest that let's take a break and come back at 11:20. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
broke for a few minutes. Rachel was ready with a new primary question on mitigation.
That's right. Now, what was it?
Yeah.
The trickiness, isn't it? Three questions, actually. One is
Try one to start.
the discussion that we just had about, just before the break, had about the split gases. Very quickly to clarify that even though New Zealand takes a split gas approach, and even though New Zealand has a different emissions profile than everywhere else also has to measure methane. Yes? Yes. No. Then interested in, you were at the start of this period undertaking a review of the ETS, and that funding is gone now for the review, but everybody still seems to be saying, and we have the outgoing climate commissioner, that the ETS settings need work. So if you can comment on what work can be undertaken to improve the ETS, that would be useful. And also second emissions reduction plan, obviously that's in draft at the moment, and I appreciate you've already mentioned, James, that there'll be cabinet decisions on it soon, but we have had also that announcement. My interpretation of that emissions reduction plan draft, number 2, is that it relies very heavily on the planting of more pine trees. And then yesterday we've had announcements by the government that they want to maybe see a decrease of that, or have some constraints on where those pine trees are planted. How do those two ways of looking at climate emissions in our environment work together? Do you see that there's going to be any conflict between that draft emissions reduction plan and the announcement? And what work are you continuing to do to make the ETS work better?
Thank you. So just to clarify, the funding that was returned in budget 24 related to ETS market governance was not funding for the review of the ETS. The review of the ETS was being funded just through the departmental appropriation and the ministry. So there hasn't been any end to that funding.
Thank you.
Yes, the incoming government cancelled the review that was underway, and were concerned that it was destabilising confidence in the ETS because the review was posing some particularly fundamental questions for the future of the ETS's function. The government has continued to work on ETS settings, however, and so there were unit supply decisions around future auction volumes earlier this year. The government has continued to review, or the ministry has continued to review for ministers baseline allocations for industrial allocation. And there are decisions that will be made before the end of the year on that. And that is about ensuring that there is no oversupply of units through industrial allocation. Those two pieces of work combined resulting in a reduction in the stockpile of excess NZUs. And I think yesterday's auction outcome demonstrates that we're at a point where the market is feeling more confident about the scheme, and the price reflects that. The fact that the entire volumes did not clear was not unanticipated, given that we'd had a rollover of units through the year, but we did have 4 million units that were sold and 7 million units that were cancelled out. So the net effect of that is that we're continuing to see the stockpile go down, and we would anticipate that continues into next year. As a consequence of that, the ministry's confidence that the ETS will deliver emissions reduction and removals in line with what the government is seeking by way of its overall strategy is increasingly, we're increasingly confident of the achievement of that. So I think it's fair to say that the ETS continues to be amended, if you like, not quite the right term. Settings under the ETS continue to be modified, and they continue to improve the functioning of the mechanism for reducing emissions. So that piece is achieving the improvement to the functioning that the review of the ETS by the previous government may have been seeking. It's fair to say that emissions removals from forestry activity has always been part of New Zealand's trajectory towards net zero by 2050, and always assumed to make a substantial contribution. So it's not that the ERP2 draft consultation document that was released is premised on a significant increase. It's premised on the fact that forestry will continue to provide a level of removals that takes us on a track towards net zero by 2050. Yesterday's announcement in terms of LUC 1 to 6 and constraints on planting will have a minor effect, but overall the assessment is that there is still considerable volume of land, both within the exemptions that sit in those new regulations, but also obviously in Class 7 as well, for afforestation to continue to occur. So was there anything else, Hemi, that was in the question that I haven't covered?
I think the key thing is what you've highlighted, James, around forestry is going to play a part to us meeting our targets, and 38% of New Zealand's land area is forestry land, and 8 million of that is in natives, and about 2 million is in exotic planting. Now, 90% of that exotic planting is Pinus radiata. And the Commission have highlighted in their advice, in their draft advice on the 2050 target and emissions budget that they think we need about 500,000 hectares of exotic forests in the period from 2021 to 2035. So it's quite a large volume of forestry. What we have observed over 2021 and 2022, and what we estimate we'll see in 2023 and 2024, will account for about 280,000 of that total. And so over the next, 14 or so years, or 10 years rather, we expect that we'll need anywhere between 20 and 25,000 from exotic forests based on that level in the earlier parts of the 2021 to 2024 period. The way that the land use conversion policy interacts with what we need to meet our 2050 target is that it puts an upper limit on how much forestry can be entered into the ETS, but it isn't going to prevent any exotic forestry that we're currently projecting to meet our 2050 target.
Thank you. Just a supplementary on that. You talked earlier about being confident of actually, delivering the emissions reduction plan. What about your level of confidence in actually meeting the targets of, and this is in regards to the draft ERP2 modelling, showing the emissions budget 2 would be achieved by less than 2 megatons with an uncertainty range plus or minus 18 megatons. Can you comment about what the ministry's thinking is there with us meeting that target?
The uncertainty range could take us outside of the target. That's certainly true. And the uncertainty range is based on some of the historic dynamic variables in the economy, such as dry years, accelerated levels of deforestation. So anomalies, if you like, that happen from time to time, and it stacks those up and gives you a sense of what a kind of a worst case scenario would look like. Our central projections have the government being on track for meeting the target for emissions budget 2. There will be further updated modelling that will be released as part of the final second emissions reduction plan, and that will continue to show confidence that the ministry has on our central projections that the government will meet its target. We will, as a country, continue to need to monitor that because of those dynamic variables. And if something happens along the way that takes us off track, there will need to be some mitigation. And so as part of the development of ERP2, we've provided Cabinet with advice on what some of those options might be, and they will have those as part of the plan, essentially as policies in reserve, if you like. Obviously, the more government intervenes, there is potentially fiscal cost and there is economic cost. So ministers, in line with the least cost strategy, are seeking to ensure that we can achieve our targets without undue economical fiscal impact. But there will be some additional levers available in the event that New Zealand starts getting off track.
Thank you. Sorry, one more stuff on that. Thank you. You know, in your report, you talked about the government having this renewed importance of the 9 priority targets, one of which, the target 9, is about, you know, meeting those targets. To what extent does the ministry see target 9 in terms of being on track towards the public service actually meeting the climate budget by the government policies that actually take agriculture out of the ETS, remove the oil and gas ban, and potentially increase coal mining through fast track? Are those moves that actually support that target, or how does the ministry see those fitting in?
So again, taking into account all of the known policy decisions by government, our current projections have us on track for meeting target 9, which is emissions budget 1 and 2. So that includes all of those? That is correct.
Thank you.
But look, there are dynamic variables in the economy. There are emissions that will result from decisions by private companies, etc., which we can't necessarily anticipate at this point in time. But based on our assumptions and what is known, yes, target 9 will be achieved.
Thank you. And then just further, I guess talking about the uncertainty of meeting targets, and we know this is a really dynamic space, you make it really clear in your report that while you're focused on current decisions, MFE does consider the intergenerational implications of decisions. What is the ministry's view on the more intergenerational aspects of deciding to act now on climate change rather than later?
So, gosh, there's lots in that question, Chair.
It's all right, we've got a couple of hours.
Look, I think I think at one level, if you took the view that in New Zealand and indeed the global community needs to do everything possible to reduce emissions, you could throw a lot more money at emissions reduction, and you could impose a lot more costs on businesses and households. Throwing a lot more money also involves putting costs on businesses and households just through a different route, that is through taxation. The reality for this in every government is that there are a set of competing priorities that also have intergenerational consequences, whether they be the economic performance that delivers outcomes for income, households, etc., whether they be in relation to health, welfare. There are many things that contribute to intergenerational wellbeing. So the government needs to weigh all of those and develop a set of priorities. So in the ministry thinking about the intergenerational nature of climate change, we don't think about it just in terms of emissions and the physical effects of climate. We think about it in terms of whole societal wellbeing and the costs imposed of the policy choices that are made. So the government's approach is well canvassed is a least cost approach, and that particularly I think recognises where we're at in both the fiscal and the economic cycle. So I guess the ministry sees climate action as being important. It is urgent, but in a society with many competing demands, it needs to be considered alongside all of those. The global community's made some choices with respect to the targets it set itself through the Paris Agreement, and that those choices don't imply no climate change or no increase in emissions. There is a level of increase of emissions that is implied and accepted by the Paris targets, even though those themselves are quite ambitious. So this is where it leads obviously into the ministry's work on adaptation. We anticipate that climate change is going to continue to accelerate and intensify as a result of the transition occurring globally and domestically. And therefore we need to be working on the adaptation elements as well. So it is a full package, and the adaptation elements will be determinative of intergenerational outcomes as well. So it's a complex set of policy considerations that government needs to weave together with a view about how do you optimise intergenerational wellbeing overall.
Thank you.
Last one.
Just quickly picking up on that categorisation of sort of least cost approach that this government supposedly taking. Does the ministry consider that is potentially a bit of a false economy when you're talking about the actual costs? Like there's a lot of evidence that says investment now is infinitely, better and more sensible than investment later.
Certainly the ministry is on record over a very long period of time of suggesting that earlier action on climate would be more cost effective than longer term. But I think there are some caveats around that. Every dollar of public expenditure or every dollar of cost imposed on the economy does come at an opportunity cost. And so you can look at the climate question in entire isolation and think about what does a dollar now versus a dollar later on mitigation alone look like in terms of its benefit. And I think that the orthodox historical economic analysis on that had been to spend a dollar now on mitigation would be better to spend it in 10 years when you are going to be in a worse position in terms of the global climate backdrop. But that's an isolated view of a dollar for climate now versus a dollar for climate later. It's not just a dollar for climate now, it's a dollar for climate now versus a dollar for health, for education, for something else as well. So it's not a straightforward choice, I guess, in terms of what is spent today just in relation to climate. It's part of a broader consideration of how government optimises its expenditure and all the things in a discrete and finite budget it has to balance and meet.
Is it a supplementary?
Supplementary.
Because I'm keen that I know that we start talking about climate finance. I'm keen that we should wrap this up really soon.
So I'll make it very short. So when you talk about balance, do you think that there is a true balance between funding emissions reduction or supporting emission reduction initiatives versus health, education, etc., given that it's an existential question we face, whether there will be massive impacts on society and risk not only to other animals, flora and fauna, but to human life, and then as a consequence of climate breakdown. Do you think it's really a question of balance, or of, as you talked about, needing more urgency, needing more bolder action?
So the balance question is not one for the ministry, it's one that I'm simply observing that governments both here and internationally have to confront, and that is the fact that for every dollar they spend or dollar they impose on the economy, there is an opportunity cost in another direction, and what they have to balance are the competing priorities that society has. So I think these are essentially these are value questions and societal questions about prioritisation. There will be those in the community who are of the view that a greater level of action on emissions reduction is more important, both in the short and long term, than a dollar spent on health. There will be people in the community who have a different view of that. And it is the role of the electoral process and the role of government to weigh up those different societal preferences and reflect those in decision making.
And I think there'd be others who suggest it might be better to spend on climate than on landlords or on tobacco giants as well.
Okay, Rachel wants to now start a line of questioning in relation to finance.
Thank you. And actually, it segues very well from that discussion on intergenerational effects and least cost, which of course is different from making it worse, which was Lean's line of questioning. But talking of in the long term, if New Zealand doesn't meet its NDCs and if there is a liability for international offsetting, when or what is your advice about when government should start recognising that in its books?
That's a question for the Treasury. It's not a question for the Ministry.
So you give no advice on that?
No, that is not within our remit.
Okay, thank you. That was an easy answer.
That was good. Okay, look, unless there are other questions on that, let's move on because we've got several other areas that we want to talk about. So how about we now move to environmental management systems, and if there are questions relating to the revised RMA reform in freshwater, now would be a good time to ask them.
Yes.
Rachel.
Okay. Look at this. Yes. So one thing, we've obviously had a lot of time in committee of the whole house discussing some of this legislation that didn't go to this committee, to the Primary Production Select Committee. And what I was seeking from the Minister and didn't get was some comfort or promise of work to analyse the effects of these changes in the regulations. It was the Freshwater and Other Matters Bill changed lots of different regulations. Also then changed sections of the Resource Management Act, which personally I thought was out of scope. But what work, so maybe you can provide me some comfort that MFE will be undertaking an analysis of what those changes mean for the environment. And if the Minister would say that they were all going to be absolutely fine for the environment, what will happen if that's not the case? Will that be drawn to the Select Committee's attention, or is the approach just to hope that it all blows over?
So as I think the committee is aware, the Freshwater and Other Matters Amendment Bill included a range of quite surgical changes to the RMA that heavily process related. They were not fundamental changes to Part 2 of the Act, such as matters of national importance or the overall weighting of decision making. So they will have micro effects, if you like, on individual consents.
Well, 107 could have quite major effects.
So yes, 107 is an example of where
Which wasn't
there
before the Select Committee.
is something of greater flexibility, if you like. Having said that, the practical implication of 107 could well be to effectively confirm the status quo.
But it might not, and that's my question. It's not that, and that was my question in committee. So for the rest of the committee that wasn't on the Primary Production Committee, the changes to section 107 were not in the bill as introduced. Some submitters tried to submit on it and were allowed to. Others tried to submit on it and were not allowed to. And so the only examination of the issue was in the committee of the whole stage of Parliament. And in that, the Minister would give no comfort that the issues that were raised by people like Forest and Bird, who wanted to submit on it, who weren't allowed to submit on it, had with the change. So if it is just the status quo and if nothing goes wrong, no one will have a problem. But there is a concern that there will be problems arising with that change to section 107. So what work will the Ministry be doing to analyse the impacts of the change and to draw the attention back to the House if those changes are negative on the environment.
So through our ongoing work monitoring the implementation of the Resource Management Act, the ministry will get a sense of whether there are any issues that arise from the implementation of that amendment and provide advice in due course if required. It's likely that before the effects of that are well known, we are well into phase 3 replacement of the RMA. And so what we're seeking to do is to take all of our learnings about the existing RMA and recent concerns that have been raised through things like court decisions that gave rise to the Section 107 amendment are taken into account in designing the new system. So I think the replacement of the RMA will be the place where the ministry will be able to give advice about what a new system will deliver by way of environmental outcomes as well as the economic, social, cultural ones too.
Okay, and so related to all those changes and the in freshwater and other matters, we've got, of course, the fast track bill, and you've already answered a question from Lan about how, when we were asking questions again about what the environmental outcomes are, and you said, well, we should assess it on a case by case, it's a framework. And I really have a huge problem with that answer, James, and that is because, of course, the purpose of that piece of legislation is to promote or facilitate projects and other development. And so it's not a framework, it's not a process bill, it's really clearly not a process bill whereby you're sending projects off to be considered faster and in a joined up way under existing legislation. It's very clearly not under existing legislation, because the thing that decision makers have to give the greatest weight to is that purpose, which is to get things done regardless of the environmental effects. So I think the ministry should be able to give advice on, particularly now that you have those 149 projects, on what the environmental outcomes might be if decision makers do in fact take that purpose to facilitate projects over the existing environmental legislation as set out in the fast track bill. Can you comment on what analysis you've done on that?
So first of all, what I would say is that a change to the weighting of considerations under decisions under the fast track approvals bill is still a question of process. So yes, there is a change of substance, if you like, in terms of the introduction of a new weighting test, but it's still a process question. Each and every project that comes through will have to be considered on its merits. And until each of those have presented an assessment of environmental effects, as they are required to do under the fast track approvals bill, it would be simple guesswork on behalf of the ministry as to what the actual environmental implications of any given proposal would be. Obviously, we're familiar with the list, we're familiar with the projects at a headline level, but the detailed assessment of environmental effects would be all still part of the process.
Except, of course, some have already had detailed assessments of environmental effects and have been declined because of those environmental effects. So how can it possibly be about process only when they're going to be reconsidered under this legislation? The whole purpose of this legislation is to enable those projects that were otherwise declined because of environmental outcomes. It's a paradigm shift.
So what I think we can say generally is that the purpose of the legislation is to not only speed up the process through faster consideration and through a
We already had
one-stop
that
shop.
legislation.
It is also to shift the overall weighting towards the national and regional benefits of the projects that come forward. So it is likely that on any given project, the overall level of consideration in the decision making, particularly for something that might have an approval under the Resource Management Act, for example, will incorporate some greater weighting towards those regional and national benefits. So they will be weighed against all the matters that are normally weighed under the RMA, and therefore it's quite possible that we will get decisions arising under the Fast Track Approvals Bill that will differ from the decisions that may have been taken under
That's
the
right.
Resource Management Act. And I
Because
think
they're
that's
covered.
clearly, that's within the purpose of the bill. But what I'm just saying to the committee is that it's not practicable to assess the outcome of any of those individual projects before they have been considered. Even ones that have been considered through previous processes, they will have to go through a reconsideration, and it will be over to the panels ultimately to make determinations about those questions of weighting.
Well, and we do have your supplementary analysis that does show that the ministry was opposed to pretty much every choice the government made in that bill. So I'll go back to that if I'm looking for the
a
answer.
comment rather than a question. So Lan, you've got a supplementary?
Supplementary, yes, thank you. You mentioned in your earliest comments about Fast Track being a really big piece of work for the ministry, despite your limited resources. Can you give us an idea of how much ministry staff have been involved either with the bill's development or with the administration process that's now underway or will continue? What is the quantum of that, and is it all user pays, or are there elements that have been part of basically the ministry's BAU that have contributed towards Fast Track?
So certainly the policy intention is that the implementation of Fast Track will be fully cost recovered, and work is underway to develop how that's going to occur. But the resource implications of the policy development process, I don't have those numbers to hand. I don't know, Nadine, whether you know. We can get those for the committee.
That'd be great.
I mean, it has been considerable, obviously. There has been two parts to it. We've had the team that's been working on the legislation itself, working with Select Committee. We've also had a team working to stand up the new regime, and that's been the team that's been working on the listed projects.
Would it be fair to say that it was a smaller commitment in terms of resource for your ministry than had been the case during the previous government's natural built environment and spatial planning legislation?
Oh, significantly smaller, yes.
Significantly.
And fair to say that was an.
Thank you very much. Katie Nimmin has a question.
Lovely, thank you. I really want to make a comment, but I won't. I'll just ask my question. Look, how important do you see on the RMA reforms that your team's working through at the moment being on the future of meeting our environmental targets in terms of the work you're doing to enable resetting a lot of things that we do?
Most of what we're doing in phase two is of a relatively targeted nature, and most of it I would characterise as being in response to the government's concerns about the cost effectiveness of the existing suite of national direction and the existing Resource Management Act, particularly in terms of consenting processes, but also to some extent the plan making, and freshwater being a case in point. So that I guess the general characterisation I would give is that we are working towards a set of changes that are aimed at making the system overall more cost effective.
That's supplementary. And then, so based on that, do you see then the time and resources that you're allocating as an organisation, comment included being that that is a big part of your job, enabling and supporting legislation change around environmental work. Do you think that that's adequate?
So I think our level of resourcing at the moment is adequate for our work program, yes.
And then final supplementary, do you see the reform that you're working on, talking about the targeted work in phase two, helping MFE achieve some strategic objectives that you've got as part of your plan and your work program?
So one of our headline strategic objectives is a more efficient and effective resource management system. I think our observation over time, and this was consistent with our advice that led into the previous reforms as well, is that the current system, or the Resource Management Act for most of its life, has been too cumbersome to respond to dynamic circumstances in the economy or in the environment, and too costly in terms of the processes, particularly around plan making, and that overall some of the mechanisms in the legislation are disproportionate to the benefit they give rise to or the risk that they are seeking to manage. So the near-term changes are seeking to recalibrate the system to one which is more efficient. And then the work we will be doing around phase 3, and obviously these are all choices that lie ahead for ministers, will be around the effectiveness as well. Given that the system has a scarce amount of resource. And I think, look, our overall observation would be that the resources of central government, local government, of industry, etc., are finite. And so what's essential for the resource management system to achieve its greatest possible set of outcomes is how effectively those scarce resources are deployed. And the effort that we would like to see that the system being put into is where the greatest areas of risk lie.
Thank you. Lan's got a sub.
Yeah, thank you. It's really a two-part supplementary just on the meeting environmental limits and targets. And the first part of it is in regards to your first strategic priority and one that you said you weren't able to achieve. And this was that the resource management system is supported effectively to deliver improved environmental outcomes. Now, the reason given was the repeal of the SPA and the MBA. Why is it though that that couldn't, potentially still be achieved, albeit in a different form in your work that's going into the new RMA system? Can you explain that a bit?
I mentioned earlier on to the committee that the funding we received in budget 24 was for the policy and legislative development of a new resource management system, and that questions around resourcing the implementation of a new system were matters for ministers yet to make decisions on and would be subject to future budget decisions. So the change in our strategic intentions reflects the fact that previously we were significantly resourced to support the environmental management system to effectively stand up a new framework, a new legislation. The majority of that funding was returned as part of the repeal and subsequent budget savings package. What we're now left with is the policy and legislative piece. And until the ministry is funded to implement a new system, I wouldn't say that we are as positioned as we were to be able to achieve that sort of strategic objective.
Okay, thank you. And then the other aspect, there was a specific spending initiative called limits and targets. And it's described in budget 2021 as designing, delivering and implementing comprehensive and sustainable reform of the resource management system. And it talked about there was a project to set limits and targets for that system. But then because the MBA was repealed, an evaluation on that will not take place. But it said that the proposed attributes on which limits and targets were set were reviewed and endorsed by an independent expert panel.
Correct.
Can you talk us through where this work is at and is it feeding through into where the government is looking to go?
So the previous legislation envisaged that there would be national limits across the five domains. Six domains that the statute set as necessary for the national planning framework to respond to. And the technical work was undertaken as part of the reform program to enable those limits to be in place as early as possible once the new regime came into place. And those were peer reviewed and endorsed. So that work, if you like, was ready to go in its kind of beta version, if you like, for the new system. Upon the repeal of the MBA SPA, that work was stopped because obviously there was not a legislative framework for that to go into. So the work is, if you like, in abeyance, but the work is not of no future value because we've now done, I guess, the technical work to establish how you would set mandatory national limits across those 6 environmental domains. The cabinet decision, and we have obviously a cabinet paper that has been released on phase 3 RMA reform, does identify that the new regime will need to have clear and enforceable environmental limits. And so we anticipate that the work that we did previously will be able to be incorporated into the next phase of resource management reform. But until the system design decisions have been made, there won't be any sort of immediate work to incorporate those at this stage. But yeah, I would say that the work's not lost and it will be useful for the next phase.
Thank you. Noting those decisions haven't been made by the ministers, is there any reason that MFE sees why like robust science-informed limits and targets wouldn't be part of a new RM reform system?
No, I think we see them as a necessary part of the new system, and Cabinet has indeed indicated that that is one of the principles on which it envisages the new regime to be operating.
Awesome, thank you.
New question.
New question? Oh, sorry, Glenn had one first.
Thank you.
Environment.
Yeah, I want to come to fresh water, and obviously yourselves and Ministry of Education commissioned the piece of work that was done around National Drinking Water Quality Survey for rural schools. Can you just talk us through a bit of that process, I guess your relationship with the Ministry of Education and a bit about those findings, please?
Staff Natasha to talk to this one. She's probably best placed.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And I just want to note that this issue, the issue of nitrate in drinking water, is a complex issue where the science is still evolving internationally. It's really important for us to stay attuned to the developments of science in this area. And it's something that we are very mindful of. This particular study, important to work with other agencies where there are issues to build understanding and be able to quantify risk. And that's also important for us in working with the Ministry of Health, who have, primary responsibility when it comes to thinking about the public health risk within this. So, yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of, I guess, the relationships with the other ministries, can you just talk a bit about that? And in terms of, I guess, again, with the cost savings this government's put in place, is any of this at risk, or in terms of the work that's being done, the work is continuing to, I guess, move forward from obviously the report that's in front of us?
Yeah, we will get to this in the next agenda item as well, but to our purpose as an organisation through our refined strategic intentions, the role of evidence and data in informing decision making sits at the heart of that process. So we see the responsibility we have to make sure that data is available, data is accessible, and that involves partnering with other agencies, where there's relevant initiatives that we can work together on. So just trying to understand the specific
I guess it's just ensuring that there's good working relationships, because obviously, as you say, it's complex, but it's obviously really important in terms of, so I guess it's just making sure that the mahi's being done. And then I guess continuing on that, in terms of where you as MFE fit, I guess, in terms of the going forward, and is there a team that you have stood up for this, or is it, what does that look like?
So we do have a team that works on the freshwater policy instruments, and team reports to Nadine. They are presently working on the next iteration of the National Environmental Standard on Drinking Water, and it is anticipated that that will be consulted on as part of the suite of national direction next year. So these various studies that have been occurring around the country, and the Ministry of Education is one of a number. Will be informing the policy development around how we and where we set our standards for drinking water.
Was it surprising in terms of the results? Obviously, there's a reason the work was done, but were there surprises in, what was found in the report from Genius Science?
So I've read the report, and I did not. I wasn't altogether surprised. What I saw was what you do find, particularly with groundwater takes in rural communities where often the well is relatively shallow, it hasn't been put to a depth and in a location that enables confidence around a high degree of purity that you might expect from a major municipal supply. And so you see contaminants, particularly from volcanic soils, coming through, and you also see metals coming through from pipe network too, which will go to the age of some of that infrastructure. So I think, I've been a trustee of a country school, and I can visualise many of these small schools around the country who have probably quite old wells, probably quite shallow, probably not in the most ideal location, and in most cases probably haven't relied on any type of filtration. So I think there's just a modernisation exercise for schools to go through around ensuring that they understand what the water quality is. It will be variable around the country, and what they're doing about it. Where there are, and there was a relatively small number overall of school drinking supplies that are high in groundwater nitrates, I think that is part of a broader consideration for those communities around upstream land use, how that's being managed, etc. And that will all come through the guidance under the National Environmental Standard and be work for regional councils to do in their areas around source protection.
I guess the question I'm probably trying to ask earlier was around, I guess, who takes responsibility in terms of, working with schools?
Yes.
Is that something that you're doing? Is it something the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health is doing, or is it all the above in terms of, I guess, in terms of your work program to ensure that we do work through this and get it right and doesn't sort of fall through the gaps, I guess?
So not a primary responsibility for the ministry. So obviously Taumata Arawai, the National Drinking Water regulator, as well as Ministry of Health, have primary responsibility here. With our devolved schools model, boards of trustees and schools are responsible for managing their own affairs. So the Ministry of Education provides a support role, but does not directly manage these things. So these are questions for individual schools to manage. I think they're pretty well supported by government agencies. Our role is to assist via the Resource Management Act with tools that enable others to make good decisions. And so we're working with those agencies in the development of that National Environmental Standard.
Thank you. Rachel?
All right. Oh, I was going to move to
do you want to-
environmental information and
Okay,
reporting.
so are we happy with that, colleagues?
Oh, I've just got one more.
Yep, okay.
Thank you. So this is on, sorry, I'll just see what target it is. Oh, it was still in strategic priority 1, transforming the environmental management system. But it was work that you did activity for about providing a system perspective on oceans policy. And there was a number of work that was going on that was stopped when the MBA and SPA were repealed. But there was still a number of elements of work ongoing, such as with Environmental Defence Society, and several policy projects in the marine space. Can you just expand a little bit on those and whether there is any ongoing work at all in oceans or whether it's wrapping up?
So we did receive a report that we contributed to from EDS on marine spatial planning in the last year. I think it's fair to say that this work has narrowed its focus on the Hauraki Gulf, and the agency leadership there is really DOC and MPI, and we've been continuing to provide assistance there. But at this point in time, more widespread reform of the marine management system is going to fold into the future of the Resource Management Act, both in terms of the extent of spatial planning that may be in the new regime and could expand into the marine and coastal area, and the extent to which the new regime will manage coastal effects. We have a set of arrangements at the moment. They have been long understood as being not as well integrated as they could, with many pieces of statute, some of which are very old. The replacement of the Resource Management Act presents an opportunity to modernise some of that.
Thank you. And then just one further, so with the work with Environmental Defence Society, was that feeding into this report that they've just recently put out? Because I'm wondering about the timing of MFE's contribution and whether the government's decision to extend all the marine consents out to 2050 actually impacted on your input in terms of spatial planning in the marine environment, and whether that was adopted as part of the Environmental Defence Society's report.
Look, I don't think those two processes have been in any way connected. I mean, the other area we've been working on with MB is around the spatial permitting regime for offshore wind. So there are work streams underway on marine spatial planning, but nothing of the holistic reform nature envisaged by the EDS project.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's now move to information and reporting. Rachel.
I've got my regular question about the Environmental Reporting Bill Act and where that's at. The Minister said in the estimates hearing that we're hoping to have it in the first half of 2025. Has that changed, or is that still happening?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question and for the continued interest in this legislation. We continue to work with the Minister around this legislation. She's working with her colleagues around the potential opportunities within it. So we're still working to that timeframe at this point in time. Obviously, the legislative calendar is one that is occupied by many things. So we just need to do our best to keep moving on that timeframe.
Plan.
Thank you. I'm wanting to pick up on the ministry and all the excellent work you do in terms of scientific reports, and then how that actually feeds into decision making. And you talked about how these are a critical resource for decision makers. There was some recent analysis done about the legislation that's been moving through Parliament over since the government came in, and how the actual analysis and advice that comes from ministries is often quite severely limited due to time constraints mainly, or a lack of evidence and the ability, the time to actually put together that evidence, or evidence that does not support legislative changes. Are you actually seeing the application of your evidence and your reporting actually feeding into this government's decision making?
So I think the environmental monitoring and reporting that we do is of a particularly strategic and long-term nature. So it supports community-wide, including government understanding of the pressures facing the environment and what needs to be managed over time. So what we do see it doing is informing the ongoing design of the legislative frameworks. So if you think about, for example, our adaptation, the work that we have done over recent years around the nature of the climate change impacts on New Zealand, and we have recently released a significant body of work with NIWA on that, is informing the ongoing thinking around what the policy response is. For any government at any given time, there is also, I guess, more tactical changes to policy and legislation, which might reflect concerns about the impact of policies on particular activities within the economy, for example, or more minor changes that a government might seek. Those are often done in a time frame that is not, conducive with deep analysis, particularly, and I'd observe In my 25 years as a public servant, every time I've served a change of government, there's been a number of things which a new government has sought to achieve quickly as a result of things that were of concern during opposition or may have been manifesto or coalition commitments. So those tend to be made relatively quickly and don't tend to be informed by that more strategic analysis around the issues that the system has to respond to over time. So I think it's more accurate to characterise the system as one that is operating at all times in two speeds. As we seek to replace the resource management system, as we do things like setting limits and targets, that will be the opportunity for the science to inform that. And if I just go back to the example of the climate change adaptation framework, that is a particularly strategic piece of policy and legislative development, and it is being informed by evidence and data.
Could I just build a
Sure.
couple of points in there? I just wanted to refer back to our strategic intentions and the work that's been done there to recognise that we have elevated the role of data and evidence to inform decision making within our strategic intentions very deliberately. So we have a new strategic priority, recognising that very clearly within the new framework that will be coming through. It's to recognise the enduring nature of this work and the need for it to sustain and be elevated over time. So the work done through the environmental reporting program builds the evidence base for the country, not the only part of evidence, but a really important ongoing part of that picture. And so that, of course, is part of what we can use as part of the advice that we develop. But our role in terms of environmental information isn't just in regards to informing government. And on the specific example that James used, I just wanted to note, so that the climate projections work that was released recently, this provides projections of climate variables, so temperature, rainfall and other things. And just this week, the team were contacted by a significant honey business who have been using the climate projections information and the dashboard that we produced to help them think about the future choices and the decisions that they need to make. They've provided us some feedback about the need for that to be more granular, which is part of what we're looking at the next phase. So really important for us to be recognising the different audiences in terms of the data that we produce and the decisions being made across the country.
Rachel's got some.
Yeah, supplementary to that, you're talking there, James, about future legislation, setting limits and targets, that the information you're using will inform that. And also, I think I heard you say that climate adaptation framework work as well. And then if you can comment also on the hazards work that we were talking about earlier and spatial planning, if what work you're doing to help inform the spatial plans or legislation around spatial plans, if there are any gaps, if you've got enough information, do you think, for the hazards work that's been done and how that's going to be shared with central government and public as well?
Yeah, so well, in terms of spatial planning, so we're very early in the development of replacement of the Resource Management Act. So I think as the committee will understand, there's an expert advisory group that's presently drafting a blueprint for ministers to consider by the end of this year that will give an overall structure of the reforms that will then require a lot of detailed policy analysis, including questions of what degree of spatial planning there will be in the new system.
But there will be some, won't there? Isn't the policy that there will be some degree of spatial planning in the system? So
at this stage, ministers have signalled an intention, but there have been no final decisions taken in terms of the specific shape. So there were some principles that Cabinet has adopted, but there's I don't want to get ahead of the Cabinet process in terms of what will be in and out. And I think spatial planning is something that ministers have indicated a strong interest in having in the new regime, but specifically what that involves. The work that we've done historically around understanding the role of spatial planning has continued to develop, if you like, and we are well placed to provide ministers with advice as to how what choices there might be about how spatial planning can fit into the new regime.
And with that knowledge that you have, are there any obvious gaps, any obvious data or information gaps that can't be collected by existing agencies or not? And is there a role for AI with some of that data as well? But
I will defer to both
Yeah.
of my wise
Sure.
colleagues on this
Thank you.
question.
I might just jump in there, just particularly because you were particularly interested in the hazards piece. So that work is ongoing, and it is a critical part of both the adaptation framework work as well as the natural and built environment changes around hazards. The other layer there is, of course, how we are working alongside other agencies. I'm thinking about the National Hazards Board, for example, in terms of essentially what are the system level changes that are needed to more freely make this information available in a consistent way that can be used for decision making, whether that be through the spatial planning or that down through local government in terms of their role. And that really is a key focus for us at the moment in the work that we're doing around the adaptation of the natural hazards piece. I think, and I'll hand to Tash on the AI, but certainly what we're seeing is, and this does feed into more broadly the science sector reforms and how digital information is coming together, opportunities in that space.
So sorry, just before you do, so then what you're saying there is in the FEC report on the climate adaptation, see how important it was that
Yes.
information was available. So you're looking at the moment where there might be gaps and
Yes.
how things could be improved. Okay,
Yes.
great, thank you. Sorry.
Lan's got us.
Oh, no,
Chair,
no,
Oh, sorry.
sorry if I
Sorry.
could
Okay,
just,
getting ahead of myself.
build on that point. So to my earlier comments about the reduction that we had to make in terms of our science and data investment and the refinement of focus. So that is meaning that we're putting our focus on natural hazards and on land use data sets in the first instance, the monitoring systems that sit behind those things. So just to give a bit of an example and a bit of a flavour for what we're dealing with, we know that there's more than 1,300 different data sets when it comes to climate adaptation, held by 109 different organisations.
So
And
those are universities and councils
that's
and
right,
GIS.
that's right. Yeah, and many of those data sets, up to almost 20%, are not accessible. So they're restricted access for
You're gonna
various
pay for them
reasons. So
or the-
accessibility
yeah.
is a real focus for us. We've done that with the climate projections work, and we will continue to look at this, as well as what opportunities there are for new technology. So your point about AI, we have to look at efficiency and the way in which data is collected, analysed and used. And so it's certainly a focus for us. We're working alongside DPMC on our next long-term insights briefing, which will focus on natural hazards at this stage, according to our consultation. So we're heading in that direction. And the data underpinning decisions is absolutely fundamental in that picture.
Okay, thank you.
Lan,
Just
this time.
a supplementary broadly on the environmental reporting system and how it's working, but particularly your relationship with regional councils. If you had, a magic wand, because what would you be doing? Because there's this constant stream of like, if only we had more data, we could be making better decisions or whatever. But then particularly with MFE, there's this reducing budgets and funding constraints and all of this. So how are you going to be improving in this space when you're so constrained in your ability to actually put resource and investment into data?
I can go.
Probably.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And just recognising that in terms of this issue, this is well documented over time. You can see through various BIMs that we have produced ourselves, our briefings for incoming ministers, but also the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and others. So often what we see is data gaps, but often it's about consistency and it's about interoperability between data sets. And so for us, we're really focusing on how can we really make the gains in terms of consistency, in terms of efficiency, in a targeted way so that we can drive that change over time. Putting effort into the places where we'll make the biggest difference. It is a fragmented system, it is a devolved system, and that means that really looking at some centralised controls to help improve the standards of data. We work closely with the Regional Council through the NEMS program. So that's the Environmental Standards Program that we have provided funding in the last year and over many years to help improve the standardisation and consistency of data across the country.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to talk in terms of when it comes to information and reporting, in terms of engagement in the Māori space, mātauranga Māori, et cetera, in terms of in your reporting. Can you just talk to us how you're incorporating that in the mahi that you are doing, please?
Thank you for the question, and you can see this within our reports that we produce. I've got a couple here if anybody wants to take a couple home with them. For us, we think about the range of evidence sources that we need to draw on to build a holistic view of the issues. Our reporting system works within a framework, an international framework of pressure, state, impact. So that's really important for us to understand state, but also what are the pressures impacting and what are the impacts. Within the Environmental Reporting Act, we have specific responsibility to report on and consider impacts to Māori. And so through our reporting program, we have looked to mātauranga Māori as a knowledge source to help us understand impacts to Māori through that, working with Māori researchers and others to help support and inform that work.
And is that continuing to grow in terms of, I guess, over recent years? Is there more engagement in the space than has been before, or it's just continuation of what you've done for a long time?
Yes, as I have noted, we have seen some reductions in our overall budget in terms of science and evidence. So we will continue to be focused and deliberate about the investments that we can make. But when we think about knowledge sources and when we think about evidence, we think about the range of evidence that can be drawn on. Local-based, place-based knowledge, mātauranga being a part of that. So that continues to be the case.
And I guess you've probably mostly answered it, but in terms of what this brings to your reporting and into that, I guess the going forward, it's as a ministry, it holds a crucial part to the work you do.
Yeah, I think I know you've heard recently from Simon Upton in his report Going with the Grain. And so through that report, really talking about the importance of having information at place that's relevant to communities that they can connect to and understand at place. Sometimes that place-based knowledge might be through citizen science, sometimes that might be through observational means, but there's a range of sources to ensure that communities can understand the evidence picture and connect and relate to it. And that's where some of these more place-based knowledge sources can help.
And just finally, in terms of, I guess, internationally, and coming back to home, are you seeing other examples? Do you look around the world to see other Indigenous practices in, I guess, organisations similar to yourselves who are doing similar work, and have you taken any advice or support from that in terms of the work that you do?
We work always looking out across globally what's happening, and certainly when it comes to environmental reporting, we have had close connections with Australia over the years. And in their most recent State of Environment report, they had a kind of co-authorship with Indigenous knowledge as part of that report. So it's a trend that you can see in different places across the globe.
And I do have one more, sorry, because I'm a politician, so I always have one more. You talked about going against the grain as an example, but any other examples from the past year where you saw the powerful significance of acknowledging and using mātauranga Māori as a part of your reporting?
So in front of me here, I have the two reports that were produced during the reporting period. That's our atmosphere and climate report and our land report. So there are consideration of a range of knowledge sources within both of those reports. And the ongoing work that we do as we seek to inform policy advice draws on a range of knowledge sources and information and evidence.
Okay, let's move to waste,
Great.
not want.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, Rachel.
When I'm allowed, yeah, thank you. Things come up. is the start of 10, the legislation, where's that at?
So we have continued to work with Minister Simmons on an amendment bill, and it is anticipated that that will be introduced next year. Is there anything to say?
No, just in addition to that, along with the work that James has mentioned, we've also been focused on the implementation of the amendments that were done through the budget process during the year.
On the levy?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I've got some questions on the levy too, but so we can expect to see a bill at some point next year. Are you able to tell us if it's significantly different from the work that was undertaken in the previous government?
No.
No, it's not details, something. No.
No, you
So-
can't tell us, or no, it's not significantly different?
Well, so
Both.
Yeah.
The minister has received advice on the matters that were being progressed by the previous government. So that was part of the starting position, if you like. The bill itself has not gone through cabinet, so we wouldn't want to preempt any decisions that cabinet will make on that.
Sure, thank you.
Rachel.
Yes, so other things that are happening, I want to talk a little bit about recycling within New Zealand, and note, of course, the Taiwan scheme is underway now, and that's going well. Pleased about that. We changed, we have a problem now with the cardboard recycling, with those recyclers closing down. So you can correct me, but I think that means that all cardboard will have to go offshore to be recycled. And wondering if you've done any analysis into into that, or whether we need infrastructure in New Zealand for doing the cardboard recycling. Just what work's been happening as a result of that?
So
closure?
look, we've noted it occurring. Cardboard's not the only product type that has been exported historically for processing.
Sure.
I think that the opportunity is that through the Waste Minimisation Fund, that funding could be provided to develop a solution, but it needs to be a solution that doesn't require ongoing subsidisation. So the Waste Minimisation Fund is designed to enable transformation so that commercially viable and, I guess, economically sustainable solutions can come forward.
So with the Action Investment Plan, that sort of funding you're talking, or the
So the fund itself in general terms is not designed to subsidise the processing of recyclable products on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is that the fund is available to develop a solution should a solution arise that creates some kind of step change in the economics. In the absence of that, if the market is not able to develop a processing solution for cardboard, then export will be the likely consequence.
So is MFE actively approaching the market to see if anybody wants to make an application, or you're just leaving it?
I'm not aware of any. It's not to definitively say that our team that works in the area has not, and unfortunately they are not represented.
Sure.
Glenn is responsible for the policy side, not the waste operations team.
Yeah.
And Sam, the deputy secretary, is on leave today.
That might be, I think probably everybody will be interested in
We can come back to the committee on
issue.
that. Yep.
Yeah, and it's really, so I know there was that, the investment policy of, those key bits of recycling infrastructure that we need in New Zealand, and the rationale for, we've only got one place that does glass, but glass is heavy and expensive to move around, and there's the furnaces there. Probably that's the right thing to do.
Yep.
Obviously, we're not always going to be able to recycle everything onshore. There's going to be tricky, expensive things that will always be more economical to go offshore. But where is the thinking about what we can do onshore, particularly with these cardboard recycling recyclers going under That would be useful, thank you. I've still got some things on the waste levy, but are you on
Are
the
you
cardboard?
sort of wanting us up or? have you
No,
got another-
you go and then I'll.
Okay.
You keep going, Rachel.
Okay, thanks. On the waste levy, we know that that was changed at the budget, but it was only changed for the central government half. So the central government half is now effectively a tax and it can do anything for the environment, and that's funding a lot of your other, will be used to fund other work. The local government side of it wasn't changed in that budget urgency. Are there moves to open that up to a wider range of?
That is one of the matters that we've been working with our minister on over the last few months that will become clearer next year.
And is that likely to go beyond things that are related to waste, like contaminated landfills, to the broader, anything to do with the environment?
It's certainly within the scope of things that we've been advising on, but I think the detail is going to become clearer next year on.
Okay, thank you. And is there, my understanding is that waste to energy is exempt from the levy. Is that correct? And is there any policy work to try and change that?
That is correct, that it is currently, there's an exemption clause in the Act. And that is one of the things that we have been advising on or pointed out, yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you do us up on that and I'll come up with a different
Then we'll
thing.
come back to Scott in a second. So you do yours now, Simon, and then Scott, just to balance things up a wee bit.
So I'm interested in how we might balance up some of our ambitions to reduce waste to landfill, given that's got some or has had significant environmental impacts in the past, and the ability to use some types of waste materials as supplementary fuels that offset volumes. So we've seen that with golden-based cement, using a whole shredded tyres, waste treated timber that can't otherwise be repurposed. So is there a risk by imposing waste levy or charges on what some people might think of as waste to energy, maybe counterproductive? Would that factor into policy making?
That's certainly part of the advice that we've been providing, which is that waste to energy is not new and that there are a range of waste streams that are going into industrial heat processes around the country that are advantageous for a variety of reasons. So that is all part of the assessment here of the incentives that any change would give rise to.
But that's specific to industrial heat. That advice. Is that in your point, Simon?
Well, certainly, yes, it's generation, electricity or energy or heat generation of waste.
Thanks.
Colleagues, just before I go to Scott's supplementary, we were due and scheduled to have a break at 12:40, but I sense that there's a potential for us to sort of push through for the next 15 minutes or so and probably conclude the hearing. So if colleagues are happy to forego a 10-minute break, I don't know, we want to just push on or?
Yep.
I'm not sure if we'd conclude the hearing though in 10, 15 minutes.
Well,
I've got
we're on-
lots of general questions.
Well, we have 15 minutes for general questions. So we've got, a little bit of time on waste. Let's see how we go. Or do you want to have a 10-minute break now?
I'm fine.
I think it sounds like a majority of us want to push on.
Well, if it had a bit of morning tea.
So Scott, you've got a supplementary.
You'll be aware that there are multinational attempts to build what are called waste to energy plants, the sort of waste to toxin plants in rural New Zealand. And I'm wondering, does the ministry consider that there's a future for these waste incineration plants and a sustainable and cost-effective waste management system? Is there a place for it when we're actually trying for waste minimisation and knowing that these plants are not favoured, they're closing down overseas, knowing that they have only ever existed when they've had massive contracts with local government to supply large quantities of waste, knowing that they rely on a constant stream of waste? Is there a future for this type of plant in Aotearoa?
It is difficult to generalise given the the previous point around a gradation of activities that use waste streams for production of energy. Clearly, there are environmental issues, particularly with respect to contaminants and emissions that need to be managed. So those are all matters that will be considered during any consenting process, obviously, and there would be a range of environmental impacts that would need to be assessed. Whether or not the economics stack up in terms of future projections of waste volumes, etc., would be something the ministry would not seek to second guess. We would essentially leave that to the market to determine. But overall, the existing waste strategy, and that is up for a refresh by the minister imminently as well, is predicated on reducing waste overall. So if the overall direction of travel is less waste volumes, then that would necessarily mean that there could be in any given locality a declining volume available for an incineration plant to be economic. But those are choices that others would need to make.
And just to go to the specific, you'll be aware that that Searle has put a request to fast track its incineration plant at Waimati through the fast track process. Will you be providing evidence or support or information to the panel, to the fast track panel, when it's declared, when that project goes through, on the toxic risk of an incineration plant or of any aspects of the incineration plant, or is that someone else? Is that not something you do, or would you be involved?
So typically the ministry doesn't provide advice on individual applications or activities under the Resource Management Act or the legislation that we are responsible for. The Minister for the Environment, with responsibility for things like hazardous substances, would in all likelihood be invited to comment through the process, and we may on her behalf provide comment. But in the normal course of events, we would expect the environmental effects to be assessed by the panel through either directly procuring independent advice to assess the evidence presented by the applicant, or that they would receive that from submitters. So they need to, and they are empowered to, under the bill, to make assessments about what information they require in order to arrive at their judgments.
Just supplementary to that discussion, would you foresee MFE, though, through the minister, giving advice on the quantities of waste that are, because that's quite a specific issue that MFE would have the data for?
Potentially, would need to determine whether or not, in our dialogue with the EPA and with the panel, whether that's information that is of use to the panel, and if it was, then that's information we could provide.
Yeah, I've got new questions. Yeah, so a question related to that, you had there was an annual reduction in the waste in this reporting period. Was that because of the cyclones the year before having had lots of waste, or is it because the waste minimisation things are working well? Can you comment on that, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So obviously with every year, there'll be slight variations. Often it's tied to economic activity and growth. But there was a reduction, I think, of about 11%, 23-24 when compared to the year previous. We haven't really analysed in detail fully why, but I suspect part of it could be the waste that was generated through the cyclone events. That had quite a strong contribution in waste volumes in those areas.
And have you done much analysis on how the curbside recycling is working and the various different work streams that the ministry is doing?
Not at that level of detail. I mean, we are getting a lot more information than we previously used to. So we are starting to get detail from district councils about how much they are collecting with curbside, etc. So that will be stuff we'll be able to analyse into the future now.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just build on that point,
Yeah.
Glenn? So the waste regulations that were introduced in the last year mean that the level of data and the granularity of data that we have access to is enhanced, and we've built a number of dashboards to ensure that that information can be accessible to businesses, to local government and to others to understand the flow of different waste volumes and what that looks like across the country.
Great. So we'll see that soon.
Rachel.
Yeah, a separate question. The mandate for the plastics treaty was amended by the new minister, by this minister, and we've seen those negotiations go terribly recently. Do you think New Zealand's revised weaker position had anything to do with that?
The short answer is no. I think the division between countries, particularly major producing countries and major receiving countries, was more instrumental in the lack of progress on that treaty. I think what I would say about that treaty, which I think some commentators have similarly observed, is a little bit like the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is better that we end up with a high quality treaty over time than one that might be rushed. And this is a long game, and while the parties are standing some distance apart, there remains work to do to find more common ground. So I think, probably realistic about the fact that it's going to take a while for consensus to develop.
And was New Zealand represented at those negotiations?
Yes, yes.
We had a team of 4 officials, 2 MFE, 2 MFAT. 5 actually, 3 MFAT, 2 MFE. Yep.
Thank you. And how's the Taiwan scheme going?
Sorry, the which?
The Taiwan.
It's going very well. So it started
I signed it up.
1st of September, and I checked the stats on Monday. So we've collected just over 1 million tyres since the 1st of September.
Simon.
Just supplementary on that. So I've heard some feedback from garages that the differential cost between a truck tyre, commercial tyre and car tyre is quite arbitrary. And that they've told me that compliance with the reporting requirements is excessively onerous, given that they all support the purpose of the scheme. They have suggested to me, and I'm not sure if this has flowed through to MFE, that they would prefer to be paying for or charged for the tyres based on weight. And that is because there are small tyres which could fit the definition of car tyres but are used on light trucks. And because there are so many vehicles in New Zealand that use large rims and tyres on utes, SUVs and other cars, that they are essentially heavier than what might be considered truck tyres.
Right.
So they were asking me, is there an opportunity to revisit how the regime is established so it can be a little bit more practical what they're charging for? Have you had any feedback around that?
So look, every new regulatory regime does need a check-in reasonably early in its implementation to assess whether or not there are any unintended consequences. So there are a range of things that are being learned as the spun gets stood up. And I think we've got the opportunity to fine tune. There'll be some trade-offs around flexibility as well as the cost of accommodating that, such as weighing tyres.
And just to that, I think they pointed out to me that the weight of these tyres is all known at the time of importing.
Yeah.
Because they come with the manufacturer specifications.
Yes.
So so while there is some degradation and we know we lose some material during the tyre life, they felt that would be still a simple marginal, still a simple way to do it.
That's right. It would involve obviously more granular regulation, which might increase its complexity from a compliance point of view. But those are certainly matters that we will in discussion with the sector, take into the review of the scheme, and ministers may wish to update the regulations to accommodate those concerns.
Excellent. I'm sure that will give them confidence.
I mean, just to be clear, there already is a gradation that understand is based like
Yeah.
that, but there could well be tweaks. Yeah.
Okay, Lan, now's your chance.
Thank you.
General questions, current events, concluding observations.
I've got a.
Okay, so Lan can start off.
Mr. Chair, I just want to check in, if there is a need for people to have a break to enable the continuation of the hearing to our agreed timeframe, so we can get through our questions, I would be really open to having that break and then coming back to finish the hearing.
Well, we've got probably about 20 minutes to go on this hearing.
Okay.
So I think a majority of us are keen to keep pushing through. But thank you for the offer.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the work that's been going on into a biodiversity credit market. Two of the indicators, this is for activity 4, provide support for implementing national direction on Indigenous biodiversity, are put down as achieved, and they're about councils having identified significant natural areas in their plans, and also market mechanisms are operating to support biodiversity protection. Why have you got these as achieved rather than, like, I'm noting that there's work that's been going on, but why have you got them as being achieved, and what's next in these areas of work?
So, Chair, the activity measure itself was establishing the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, and that it would direct councils how to identify SNAs. So the NPS-IB was established, and it did direct councils how to identify SNAs and establish a timeframe. So I think it is.
Oh, I see. So it's not following through necessarily to whether councils have, and now the delay that is in SNAs, it's about talking about basically MFE's deliverable within that. Is that right?
Correct. So our job was to produce a national policy statement that directed councils how to do this, and effectively that was achieved.
Okay, thank you. And then the second aspect of the market mechanisms for biodiversity protection or biodiversity credits, can you expand on that one?
So again, the deliverable and the measure that was set is that the government receives advice on the potential of market mechanisms, and that advice was developed and provided. So the advice has been provided. Having said that, the work stream remains a priority for Minister Hoggard, and we're continuing to pursue that. So there has been a recent meeting of key stakeholder groups where we have sought their feedback on the work we've been doing recently around investor appetite, the types of biodiversity credit or market products that would be of use. And we are anticipating providing advice back to ministers early next year on options for any government intervention, should it be required, to support the development of biodiversity credit markets or equivalents. We do note that there is an ongoing level of private sector innovation in the space, and the choice for government will be whether there's any effectively a market failure that requires government intervention, or whether or not the private sector is coming forward with solutions. Certainly on the face of it, what we are hearing from industry is that some degree of government mandated framework would help with market assurance and credibility. But those are choices that ministers will need to make in time.
Cool, thank you. And then really following on from you mentioning Minister Hoggard, jumping to freshwater farm plan systems, what work is now underway seeing the rollout of freshwater farm plans has been paused?
So we've been working with the Minister to work through the options around the recalibration of the regulations and the framework, and those decisions happening contemporaneously. And we are anticipating as part of the package of phase 2 national direction reform next year that the regulations will be updated and there will be a rollout. Indeed, some of it will come through Bill number 2, which is due obviously before the end of the year. So there remains a commitment to a freshwater farm plan system. It's the detail of that that ministers are making choices on to ensure that it is calibrated to risk and it's being implemented in the way that's, I guess, most cost effective as possible.
Thank you. Lucy.
Rachel, did you have
Yeah, I've got
a question?
yeah.
I know Glenn's got one and probably Lance got another one.
Yep.
Yes.
One related to biodiversity, short one. The recent COP on biodiversity was New Zealand represented there?
Yes, New Zealand was. I don't think so. Department of Conservation only, I think.
There were also EPA staff
EPA.
there and maybe other agencies.
But not MFE.
Not MFE.
Different question. How is MFE's relationship with regional councils when under urgent, well, in like one session, we'll suddenly get a amendment paper dropped on us at lunchtime and be debating it in the afternoon to stop regional councils from doing the things that they had been required to do by law in terms of notifying their water plans?
My perception is that the relationship remains in good heart. If regional councils have a different view, you'd need to test that with them. We continue to meet regularly with regional councils, both at the chief executive level and then also at the working level. We've had a number of engagements in recent months about the cumulative set of reforms in the resource management space, including on freshwater. And so we maintain a high degree of communication and engagement. We understand their issues and challenges and continue to incorporate that into policy advice and continue to help them understand decisions as they are made in both legislation and in policy. So, I mean, we've built over time a very high degree of collaboration, if you like, with them as delivery arm for much of what sits in the Resource Management Act. And it remains constructive and productive.
And what analysis had MFE done on the draft, not yet notified Otago Regional Council's plan that was subject to their intervention to demonstrate how incongruous or how in conflict it was with proposed changes to national instruments?
So the ministry did engage with Otago Regional Council. We did consider the content of the plan, provide advice to ministers on plan content, and ministers themselves had a high degree of engagement with ORC, and there was an exchange of views, etc. So I wouldn't have said that there were decisions taken in the absence of either advice or engagement with
So
Otago
that was
Regional
an
Council.
analysis of the plan that was about to be notified, not of earlier versions of that.
Correct.
And so you're saying that that was inconsistent with the direction that ministers want to go in with their national direction. And my understanding is that the plan was workable and that the only differences that we could really have is to enable more pollution. And so am I to infer that that is where the government wants to go with changes, further changes to our national regulations around freshwater management?
So the issue we were working through with ministers was not the consistency or otherwise of the plan with the direction of travel on freshwater reform. It was the fact that Cabinet has yet to take decisions on amendments to the National Policy Statement on freshwater management. As the committee will be aware, there is a public consultative process to go through there is some big policy decision making that needs to occur. So ministers were concerned that the plan was being progressed ahead of those decisions about what the future
So
system
hypothetical
looks like.
decisions that would be to enable more pollution might happen, so the regional council should stop its plan.
So because the government still was yet to decide what the future system would look like,
But it might be
ministers
to enable more pollution.
Or not.
Cabinet has not made decisions yet on the changes.
So they went to the
SFU.
trouble of stopping the regional council, so that must be under consideration.
I think the concern ministers have had is that plan changes were progressing by regional councils on the basis of a previous national policy statement that
The current one,
that the government had.
the law.
That
the time.
Well, the existing national policy statement that the government had indicated that it would, and certainly had agreed within the coalition agreement, to review. So
It hasn't yet.
it is presently working through the review of that national policy statement. Advice has been provided to ministers. There will be a revised version that will be consulted on next year.
Glenn.
Thank you. As you said at the start, it's been a big year, and obviously change of government, that's fairly natural, but it feels like there's been a lot going on in terms of change of direction, priorities, work plan of exiting from a lot of spaces. You also talked about in terms of staffing and what you've had to do, and I think it was 700 people had to reapply for their roles. That's huge. And I just want to ask around the wellbeing and morale of staff and how things are going at the ministry.
It's been a difficult year, balancing all of that for all of our people. We have seen an increase in use of our employee assistance program in terms of staff seeking support and advice. The uplift in that was particularly in relation to career decisions and anxiety relating to people's job security, as to be expected. The good news is that we were able to provide support for our people through that period. And look, overwhelmingly, the organisation, as I said earlier, has continued to deliver a very high standard of work. And I think that speaks to the commitment of our people to the work that they do. We have recently resurveyed our staff in terms of engagement, and unsurprisingly, it has taken a little bit of a drop. But having said that, there is still very high levels of engagement in many parts of the business. There are parts of the business that are very tired, and the run up to Christmas is a big one for those working, particularly on legislation that is coming through this period, and those that have been working in the climate change space on, for example, the emissions reduction plan, but also a number of the decisions that have been announced even in the last 24 hours. It's been a big body of work. So we'll end the year tired, as much of the public service, and I imagine most of Parliament as well. But overall, we think that we're in a good place for next year in terms of the capability that the ministry holds, the leadership that we have, the types of our supports that we provide to our people in doing their work. So I'm not sitting here feeling like the wheels are falling off the organisation at all. Quite the contrary, feeling like we're finishing the year well, and we'll be set up next year for another big year of delivery.
And in terms of it's hard and it's tough, and you've had to make big calls. I understand that, but often there's certainty. People just want certainty. So, yes. Are you at a place now where you're where you will be come next year? You've sort of got the staffing in the right places, etc.
So we made a very conscious decision to do effectively 2 years of staff reductions in one process, and it was precisely for that reason that we understood that with a declining baseline over successive years, that a rolling program of restructures would be debilitating to the organisation. So we did a process that enabled us to put a number of our staff on delayed redundancy, And there is in the order of 140 odd of those, off the top of my head, for the 30th of June next year. So for those people, they at least have job security till then, and that enables them to make plans around their lives. And so we've had various step downs. And so, yes, the organisation has a high degree of certainty about what lies ahead. As we go into budget 25, of course, there will be some uncertainty about where we land at the other end of that. Every budget process comes with some degree of inherent uncertainty as where you will be after that. And we still do have a downward fiscal track in out years, and we will still have more change to undertake in the future.
Yeah, and finally, in terms of staff who are Māori and in the space, I guess, working in those spaces, have you seen any impacts on them particularly? Obviously, your treaty obligations and the kind of some of the narrative from the government in terms of their well-being, in terms of the work that they're carrying out?
The reductions in headcount were greater in areas where we had fixed term funding that was coming off. And some of the capability the ministry built to work with iwi Māori in particular was time limited. You can think about funding provided for freshwater. You can think about funding provided for resource management reform implementation. And so we have seen a slightly larger number of Māori staff be made redundant as a result of not because they're Māori, but because of the types of roles they were performing relative to our funding security, if you like. So there has been a reduction in the overall proportion of our workforce that is identifies as Māori. So yeah, that has been an impact of the change process. We knew that going into it. We have a staff Māori rōpū who that we engage with through the change process. And at the outset, we foreshadowed that was a likely consequence of time-limited funding coming to an end.
It's tough.
Sorry,
Can
can I
you
just
just,
make a correction? Apologies,
Sorry.
James. Just in terms of the delayed redundancy roles, we have 81 permanent staff in those roles. The 120 roles that are fixed term, 81 permanent and 40 odd have been fixed term.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to provide some context, confirmation that at the change of the previous government back in 2017, the ministry had fewer than 500 FTEs.
Correct.
What was the peak in the last couple of years? Somewhere north of 1,200?
So the funded peak was for the 23-24 year of 1,230 FTEs. We never got to that point. Our total peak of actuals was 1,100, and you don't have them.
It was approximately 1,100.
Yeah.
Probably
Thank you.
just a
Lana.
little bit under.
If this is the last question due to our self-imposed time constraints, I'll go bigger picture to try and incorporate some things. So I wanted to touch on the ministry's role. And, you say your why is a flourishing environment for every generation. And you talk about your own establishing act requiring you to think about the needs of future generations. Does the ministry consider that it is delivering an environmental management system that serves every generation? But I'm thinking less about the government's role in balancing, the answers that you had previous, and more about the ministry's own role in delivering that system that actually does serve every generation.
Well, I think what constitutes the interests of each and every generation is something that society determines, not the ministry. And what the Environment Act 1986 sought to do by establishing the ministry, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, the minister's role, was to set up a range of system roles that supported decision-making. And the ministry's role is to ensure that we have the decision frameworks, so the legislation and the decision processes that exist within that, particularly for local government in the resource management system, the planning processes, etc. And it has the information and evidence on which to make decisions, which goes to our Environmental Reporting Act responsibilities and the science and data and evidence that we provide. So the ministry's outputs are to enable society to determine what are those intergenerational outcomes, values, etc., and to implement those into decision-making frameworks that can therefore be implemented. So the ministry is well positioned to provide that, and I think the work we did for the previous government around replacing the RMA with the MBA and SBA, the work we are now doing with the present government around phases 2 and 3 of resource management reform are examples of the ministry discharging its statutory responsibility to enable New Zealand overall at all tiers of government to make those decisions about both the short and the long term. And the decision processes themselves, particularly you can think about the planning processes and the data and evidence that we collect, enable long-term decision making as well as short-term decision making. So to that end, I think, yes, we are achieving what the legislation envisaged we would.
Thank you.
We got more?
Yeah, I do. have
Go
one.
on.
Okay,
Right
thank
now.
you.
Oh, Glenn's saying no?
No, I'll give you that.
Oh,
I'm all in.
sorry, is it me or Glenn?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
You go.
So, sorry, I'm just finding my page now, because I thought we were not showing on. This was about the treaty strategic priority, which I'm trying to find the page, sorry. Basically, there were a number of programs within the strategic priority, which was around treaty obligations and incorporating Te Ao Māori frameworks into the resource management system, which had been ongoing. But I'm wondering about, oh, here they are, sorry. It's around Māori engagement, treaty settlement commitments, and an established process in resourcing to engage Māori to actually co-design and collaborate on policy. Can you give us a flavour of how this work is continuing in the new sort of reform system or not across these activities?
So the first area mentioned there is our treaty settlement commitments. So the ministry has over 300 specific commitments in settlements that it is responsible for implementing. So we have a team that tracks those and supports the organisation to undertake those commitments. And so there's just an ongoing program of work there. That's a work in progress. Like all government agencies, the commitments that are made through settlement are not achieved instantaneously. They're achieved over time through working together. We are continuing to make progress on those commitments overall, but that will remain work for us to do over time. We have established work that we are doing directly with national bodies, so Te Tai Kaha representing the likes of New Zealand Māori Council, FOMA, and then the National Iwi Chairs Forum through Potaiao and their technicians on contemporary policy reform. There is some targeted discussion going on with those groups at the moment in relation to fresh water. So what comes next for the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management. But also those groups have also been engaging with the expert advisory group around replacement of the RMA. So we continue to engage to get their input into policy development and reflect their sentiments back to back to ministers. I think it's fair to say that we're not at a point of deep rewriting of the resource management system to the level we were in the latter stages of the last government, and not sort of deeply collaborating around the writing of legislation, because we're just not at that point. There'll be choices for ministers next year around the extent to which they want to involve those representative groups and then individual settlement groups in the more detailed drafting of legislation. So that lies ahead. So I think it's fair to say that we are continuing to engage, but we are not engaging at quite the same level that we were previously.
Just one other build on, because you asked about all of the policy. So from the policy perspective, in addition to what James has just said, we also continue to ensure that the PSGE groups are well informed and are given the opportunity to contribute. So whenever we're doing both targeted engagement and then subsequent consultation, they're well informed, and that's been a process alongside local government and other sectors that we've built up over a period of time, such that we've got those respectful relationships in order so that we can keep them informed, and it's their choice as to how they engage. And we've seen that in some areas for some groups, quite active engagement, in other areas obviously choosing not to engage on certain things.
Thank you. And then just one fund specifically, there's a climate resilience fund for Māori, 19 million, which expires in June 2026. Can you update us where this is at and whether that's likely to continue or whether it's time limited?
So we did actually touch on it earlier, but Gina wasn't here and she is
sorry.
now. So we might just give Gina the opportunity to just characterise that work, because she's leading it.
Kia ora tātou. So 19 million was retained for the current year and for next year. We are at the moment working with the National Iwi Chairs Forum, Pautake Āhuarangi, to carry out a stock take of where the most important need is and the most pressing concerns, particularly for marae and for cultural sites. We've just received the results of that initial stock take, and we'll be working with the iwi chairs to help determine what the first set of pilot projects might look like. So we're hoping to work through that through the rest of this financial year.
Thank you very much.
I tell you what, I can see just by looking from a distance at your long list of questions that you've got a lot more. And there is an opportunity for members to provide a further set of written questions to officials. And I think I'd invite you to take up that opportunity, Lan. So on that note, James, can I thank you and members of your team, not just here present today, but throughout the country, who do enormous work, who have had a year of new opportunities, new horizons, new focus, new exciting policy areas to embrace for the work that you do. I hope that you get a relaxing, safe and enjoyable Christmas, some no doubt in the beautiful Coromandel. And I again thank you for your time. It's quite a thing to be sitting in front of a committee like this for a significant period of time. And I think you've done very well. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Merry Christmas.
Yeah.